It is amazing that one should have to plead for American independence in a nation with a heritage such as ours. What foreign influence has sprung up among us? Where is the blood of such leaders as Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln? There is no division among us about the defense of our own country. We have always been ready to fight against the interference of foreign powers in our affairs. If need be, we are ready to die, as our forefathers have died before us when necessity arose. It is only when we are asked to take part in the quarrels of foreign countries that we divide. Only when we are asked to merge our destiny with that of foreign lands. Only when an attempt is made to transfer loyalty for America to loyalty for some other nation. With an army, a navy, and an air corps of high quality and reasonable size, we could have maintained our position with safety at home and respect abroad. But today, while we listen to talk of aircraft, guns, and battleships, couched in figures so astronomical that they compare only with our national debt, we find ourselves in confusion at home and under ridicule abroad. All the lessons of Europe have passed unheeded before us. The effort that should have been devoted to the welfare of our own nation has been spread ineffectively over difficulties of the other parts of the world. If we desire strength and freedom and independence for our country, the first step must be to assure ourselves of leadership which is entirely and unequivocally American. When a man is drafted to serve in the armed forces of our country, he has the right to know that his government has the independent destiny of America as its objective, and that he will not be sent to fight in the wars of foreign lands. When men are called upon to fight and die for their country, there must not be even the remotest question of foreign influence involved.
Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours. Monday, June 24th, 2024. Thank you for joining me today. That's a powerful opening. It's going to be a lot to talk about today, but I think one of the main central points of the pretty much the entire show, as it kind of has been for a while, not just in the idea of foreign influence, but just in general, the idea of, whether we truly understand what our government is. And there's parts in that I myself would, there's always something that you can pick out, like whether or not you feel that this is fully accurate in regard to what people have always fought for, or the sentiment that I think was powerful from that clip. Is the idea, whatever your thoughts about what this country was originally, if it was ever was what you have been taught that it is, the point being that there are people that believe deeply in this country, not its leadership, but it's the country and the principles we tell ourselves we stand behind. And the idea when we begin to realize that there are, interestingly, foreign entities that are and have always been influencing, co-opting your government. What's interesting is you get this conversation a lot directed at only one entity, and it depends on what side of the paradigm you listen to tell you what that one is. And I guarantee you that those active governments, like I point out all the time, all of them are doing their best to influence, control, gain benefit from what they're doing. I think the U.S. government, honestly, is one of the most obvious examples of that in the world. But I think what's important today, obviously, is to recognize the thing that I think most people are becoming very uncomfortably aware of. It's not even the ones that support Israel are having a hard time ignoring what is becoming common knowledge at this point. And really, it's about the Israeli government and the Zionist control of it that I believe is penetrating our government in a lot of ways. Now, people love to try to make that statement racism, but that's not what that's about. I'm sure there are overlaps out there in the world, but to just clumsily and blindly argue anyone that has a criticism of Israel's influence over said government, whatever that government would be, means anti-Semitism is just lazy, intellectually lazy. It's flat out dishonest. In that clip we saw in the opening there, the point that I wrote down was, they're talking about American, that your leadership should be, or going to war, and you should know that you're being led by I forget the term they use, but just as a, true American. That does not mean race. That does not mean religion. That's how they try to fold these into the two-party illusion conversation today. It just means American. Yes, and you can be an Israeli and also be American. It's not about being Israeli. It's not about being Jewish. It's about Zionism and an entity that is based, is built itself on infiltrating and manipulating religions and governments. That's what this is really about. And I thought that clip was powerful because it really highlights that point. But even as you watch that, there are people that will try to make the point about the things I just said. But it's about understanding that there are entities, whether that be China or Russia as well, that are influencing and driving actions through our government entities that are not actually fighting from an American perspective. And I think that's really important. And there's always going to be someone that wants to make that about race. And in some people's minds, I'm sure it is. What we're discussing is the valid concern about any government from any other country influencing our policy for their benefit, especially at the expense of the American people. Or if you're in Britain, same point for Britain. Any other country, same point. You should care if your government is working on behalf of a separate government at the expense of your interests. I think that's powerful. Now, today we're going to talk about that general overarching point through a lot of different things. So we're going to start with an interesting point about Ukraine, the recent bombing of Crimea in Sevastopol, and what just happened there, and how shocking it is to see the same arguments coming out of this government, which shouldn't surprise you if you've watched this show and understand the overlaps and the influence and financing coming from Israel through the Ukrainian government, also with the U.S. government, going back a long way. The most obvious example, well, debatable at this point, but of neo-Nazi and Nazi ideology in the world being openly funded by the group that pretends to stand against that everywhere in the world doesn't really make much sense until you realize that they're not really being honest about what they truly stand for or what they really are, the Zionist government. So we're going to talk about that and the interesting overlap of the same argument of human shields, but in a really clumsy way that really shows you what Israel and our governments are supporting and allowing to fester and grow around the world. That they can just murder all these people on the beaches? Well, because that's not their territory, which means there are no civilians there. There's civilian occupiers is what they actually called them in this tweet, if you can believe that. And the point, if you read it, it's very clear they're making the human shields argument. Why not? It's working for Israel. At least it's working in the minds of the governments that think this is still happening and going forward as the world seems to tear them down. But it's happening. And we're also going to talk about a lot of overlaps around the Israel conversation that I think are very important. One opening point about, COVID-19, which I do think is important. But I also wanted to talk about, in that opening point from the Russia-Ukraine conversation, a point that goes way back to Abby Martin interviewing James Corbett about gladio-B, which most of you are probably familiar with. But the idea of infiltrating countries in the same way we just talked about and building internal forces that are used for an outside benefit. To put it very simply, but there's a much more nuanced conversation around it. But this, in my mind, brings to the forefront things like the Azov movement or any number of other groups that we pointed to, the moderate rebels and the Mujahideen going back to Afghanistan. This is what our governments are doing, but even more so to a deeper conversation about how that could be happening in our countries right now. And I don't mean, that's part of it, but I don't mean the military age males coming in through immigration, which is a real conversation we should not disregard, but it's a very, very politicized and kind of like all-encompassing focal point for one side of the paradigm that doesn't seem to encompass all the other parts of the conversation, like whether Israel could be doing the same thing, but we only look to one country. But I'm talking about the idea of a government utilizing this kind of tactic in a long-term manipulative way. Again, rightly so, as some people would argue, China has long-term plans laid out for. I just don't see it as vividly apparent as I do with Israel and what they're doing in our country. But you can decide what's most important. That's always what I think is important, that you decide based on the information, come to your own conclusions about it. Whether or not I think that's the right direction, it's about what you think. We're also going to talk about an important point around RFK Jr. that I think is interesting around Israel and very importantly tied into the conversation of X, Twitter, and what Israel and the overlap of the verification system is doing there. It's another point on top of what we've been discussing. And one of the things I really want to highlight today is the incredible example of Benjamin Netanyahu stating on the record with an interview that multiple platforms have covered, saying that we'll go back to mowing the lawn in Rafah. Sure, we're going to downplay it a little bit. We're going to pivot over to Lebanon. And if we have time, we're going to get to that at the end today. And just don't worry, we'll go back to mowing the lawn in Rafah. Now, this is supposed to be a conspiracy. This is supposed to be the Diara protocol doctrine, forget whichever term they use, which means mowing the lawn. It's supposed to not even be real. You'll find arguments online. They've never said that. That's a conspiracy theory. They have said it. It's easy to prove, but now they're telling you yet again on the record, knowing people are watching, that we're going to get back to that. Don't worry. I just think this is incredible, and it shows you what our governments are truly supporting. And as well as their own government admitting in their split and division within their own conversation that Hamas can't be defeated. So what are we talking about? What are they actually doing? If they're telling you from within their own government, I mean, the leader, not the political cabinet, but the military side of this, Hagari even, there is a list saying we can't defeat Hamas. And yet they're still fighting, bombing where their hostages may be, under the argument that they're only there to continue to defeat Hamas, disregarding any ceasefire agreements. We'll get to that briefly, just in general, being that they've pulled back to going, we can't have any agreement if it's not a temporary pause. Oh, so then you were always lying, which is the reality. That is the truth. And they're now admitting this, even though the media, who's been screaming down your throat about how they were the ones that said yes, are now just ignoring it. How you can't have said yes to all of this if your point has been we've never wanted a permanent ceasefire. That's what they're telling you. This has all been a ruse. And they are massacring people in front of you while your governments and the media blindly ignore it all. Plenty more we'll get to. One quick thing to start in general before we get into it. You might have just noticed me bumping in general. I did get a newer, shorter mic stand in general. I think it will benefit when we have multiple people in the room and not the arms that I have to get in the way. Let me know what you think of this. Let me know if it sounds any different. Let me know if you like the taller one, and just give me your thoughts on it in general. Relay it to people in the chat. The mods will let me know. I'm just trying to maximize the sound and the audio and the video and everything else in the new area. And I will be giving you guys a more of a roundabout tour. The first one I gave a long time ago is just really to show you guys the developing internal room with the walls and the carpet, because this was a gutted building. Now we've got this one. We've got the pirate stream just about finished set up, which is across the room. And there's going to be, more fun stuff to show you. So it's really coming along, more things to build in general, all because of you guys. I mean, the reality being is that the support we've gotten has gone a long way for this and for other things we're fighting. But most of what's in here and the work done has been pretty much out of my pocket. But I think it's important because it will eventually, in the short term, actually save us a lot of money, which I'm worried about for the long term with the lawsuits and all of that I don't want to talk about every day. There's far more important things going on than how we're being attacked using lawfare. But if we've talked about that, I believe there's a clip Jason just put out today about our interview with Kim Iverson, where she, brought us on to talk about all of that. But it's only going to get worse, but we're not going to stop. So we're going to keep going. So let's get into it. Here is the opening clip that I played. I'll include that for you guys. It'll be right at the top of the show notes. It's called Why America Fights Foreign Wars. Narration Charles Lindbergh. And it's from a media giant account I'm not familiar with, but just interesting video. It's a powerful video to start with. Now, before we get into everything else, I wanted to highlight what many of you probably already saw, which is the Brad Miller interview, the first one we did in studio, which was really nice to talk to him. He's such a great guy, and I really appreciate his candor, his bravery, his courage during all of this to say the things he's saying, knowing he's going to get attacked for it, which is just, that's what I appreciate. That's what real courage is, not just, saying the right thing when it seems like it's going to be, the juice outweighs the squeeze or the squeeze, whatever what's the term? And I'm blanking on it. The juice is worth the squeeze kind of thing. Like realizing that, it's not whether that's going to benefit me in the long run or I'm going to get more out of, I'll say, more than positive than negative. It's just because you believe it. It's because you think it's the right thing to do. And here he is, somebody who, if you remember the previous interview we had was, for I think 101st Airborne, very prominent, high leader, went to West Point and didn't want to take the shot. Got kicked out. And we all know he was right to do so. Not just right in a legal sense or because of the military, but right in every way. Health-wise, he probably saved his life in doing so. But he's been, as we all seen, has been penalized for it. Now, we brought him in the studio to have a conversation about a lot of things. We touched on Israel. We touched on foreign influence over U.S. policy, which, again, is sort of an important part in all this. But we talked about, importantly, which I think he was not even on Tucker talking about this month ago, or would have been like January, 6 months ago. So the point being that a declaration of military accountability was something that was put out, addressed to the American people, signed by a lot of high and mid-level military, saying that we need change, that our military is not accountable, that our government is not accountable. And we all seem to know that. Problem is we all just seem to be pointing at a different part of the government. That's the two-party illusion for you guys. I'm hoping we start to see through it, but it's important that we are at least recognizing there's a problem. Always step one. You cannot solve a problem without first acknowledging that you have one. We're just not all the way there yet. We need to see the full picture, not just the left-right picture. But in any case, and again, he sees it, man. This is what I love talking with people like this that see it, calling out Trump. And it's not just about because left or right, Trump and Biden, both bad, right? Realizing that our government is not on our side. Great interview. I hope you check it out. We get into a lot of interesting stuff. Now, on the point of the COVID-19 mandate, I just wanted to include this. Put this out. And this is RJ Phoenix captioning my tweet and saying, don't let the suddenly aware drip feed, which is everywhere right now. I think, honestly, the whole rehashing COVID-19, when even though it was proven with shows that a lot of the independent media did in the first year, suddenly acting like this is now, we're kind of piecing this together. I think it's largely because of it's almost like I think it's desperation. They're at a point now where they're losing so much. Well, shoot, let's get them back. Let's get them all hooked back into this conversation. We'll get them distracted, because look, this stuff is out there. It's been out there. So when you get these high-level pundits giving you half-truth for long periods of time about something we've already hashed out, I always see that as a distraction. But at the very least, I get that some people may be open a little bit more to these conversations, but I never think that's a true positive when, at least as I see it, it's about miring you in that point, getting you to think that you see it, the full picture, and it's a controlled demolition. It is a release valve, getting you part of the truth. It is QAnon. Right? It is Russiagate. It is about getting you trapped into a manipulation, into thinking that part of the government's on your side, and just keep trusting the plan. That's what I think a lot of this is. I could be wrong. I hope that I'm wrong. But he says, don't let the suddenly aware drip feed truth propagandists and quote experts try to tell you that no one knew the jabs were killing and harming people. They did know. And they silenced or helped silence genuine experts trying to warn us all. Now, here's where I posted this. This is a tweet about Tucker Carlson, where he says, the COVID vax, all I knew. I didn't know anything about mRNA technology. I'm still not an expert on that, I think he meant. But and I'm by no means an expert on the topic, but I'll tell you what, I can talk about it. I've researched enough and done my due diligence on the topic. I've learned the science around it to where I can have a knowledgeable conversation about the science behind it with experts. You guys have seen the interviews. I've held my own in a lot of these conversations. So it's strange to me that somebody like this, who's, that high level, like it's all statement. I'm not an expert, but the idea that you're kind of pushing it off, well, I don't know much about that. It's like, that's the whole premise, first of all. But it says, but I know a lot about human deception and the behavior of the people telling me that was so transparently dishonest. I didn't know that the vax wouldn't work, which it didn't. I didn't know that would cause harm, which it did. But I did know the people selling it were lies. But you did, though, Tucker, because we were all screaming that in 2021. Some in 2020 at the end of the year. You remember this. Now, not out of hypothetical conspiracy theories. I'll play the clip for you. But because people like Dr. Bhakti, Professor Burkhardt, were telling you this stuff. They were breaking this down scientifically. And I'll play the clip for you. Dr. Bhakti was one of the earliest talking about this. All gene-based vaccines are damaging, dangerous, deadly. 2021. And yet we're going to pretend like at this. It worries me. I'll read the rest of it. He says, I knew that instantly that they were liars. Well, I think we all should have known that by now. I was like, I didn't know what this is. No one in my family was getting this. We're not doing this. I'm not doing this. Well, I didn't really get that in the early stage of this conversation. You go ahead and look back at his work, despite the way we like to look through rose-colored glasses. Quite the different time frame when you look at when he actually started highlighting things that might have been problems. Maybe he was telling his family not to. Sure as hell wasn't telling you that, but you can blame it on Fox. But wait a minute. I thought he was allowed to say whatever he wanted on Fox. Isn't that what he always told us? Anyway, it says, I figured out the first day. Okay, I did not figure it out. I still haven't figured it out, but I felt so strongly and just obeyed, and I think that works. His point was, this is him talking, speaking off the cuff. He said he figured out the first day that he wasn't going to do it, his family wasn't going to do it, but hasn't figured it all out. Okay, well, if me, no matter what stage I was in, what platform I was on, no matter how much money I was making, if I'm like, I'm not doing this, dangerous, I would tell you first. But that's me. That's just me, and probably a lot of independent media. But here's what I said. The problem is we did know, period. We knew they were causing this much damage and killing people. Why? Because experts like Dr. Bhakti and Professor Burkhart were proving this, not thinking, hypothesizing, proving this in 2021. All we had to do was look beyond our partisan barriers, blinders. We should ask why he did not.
All gene-based vaccines, independent of manufacturers, produce the same result in the vaccinees. He has looked at 15. In the last 4 days, the number has been increased to 70 individuals who died after vaccination. So these were people who died at home, at work, in the car, doing their sports, etc., etc., etc. This is very, very important. When Anna Burkhardt, professor of pathology, one of the most experienced professors in Germany, who is now pensioned, by the way, like me, proceeded to look at these organs over the last 6 months. He has spent day after day looking at these organs. He discovered something that was so absolutely damning and absolutely, there's no question now anymore about what is going on. And the answer is in the organs of these people. In 90%, he found clear evidence for autoimmune self-attack by killer lymphocytes on the tissues. The main ones being the heart, the lung, and after that, other tissues such as liver, etc., etc., etc. And this has been now posted on the website of the Doctors for COVID Ethics and is going viral around the world.
The date on that, by the way, 2021. Somebody can inform this very unintelligent person, very not intelligent person in a chat who's saying that I've apparently been promoting Tucker and Elon Musk the whole time. Don't you love how these trolls, shouldn't you do even the littlest bit of research before you pretend to come in and try to scare people away? Of all people, me? There's been a single point in time where I've been like, yay, Elon and Tucker. I haven't ever thought that. But these trolls, it's like, you got to take at least 30 seconds, do a little bit of due diligence, just a little bit.
Because these data are so damning that you don't have to start looking for other data to know that these vaccines are killing the young and the old.
Right. 2021. And well before that, by the way. I was showing you this before in regard to earlier clips that he put out. And and Arne Burkhart, by the way. And before I go forward, just another point that Patricia added, which rightly so, Dr. Thomas Bender. Remember, he was put in a mental hospital. Taylor Hudak, I'll include that, interviewed him as well. And it's a crazy story. Oh, that's frustrating. I don't know why wouldn't that pop up like the rest of them. That just keeps happening. That's so strange. Not worth bringing it up. Here we go. Nope. So Dr. Burkhart interviewed his last interview with Taylor Hudak. This came out December 23rd, 2023. While after he had passed, and unfortunately, it was a long time to, a lot of work that went into putting this together. But it's powerful, revealing the grave dangers of mRNA vaccines. He's one of the leading pathologists in the world in regard, at least in Germany, was like one of the top before he passed, and he had come back in to do this. And, there's some definite concerns about how this happened, but I think what's important is that they did know this. I'm just going to grab this interview for you, since this is going to be a long show either way. But Thomas Binder is an important example, right? Somebody who came out and said very clearly that this is, why wouldn't that pop up? It was on September 11th, in fact, 2022. And it's incredible to think about this. This is somebody who he was committed because they claimed he was crazy because he was telling you the truth in 2021. Let me grab that for you. So I just think it's important that we ask these questions. Now, it's certainly possible he just doesn't know that, but that's the point in and of itself, isn't it? Consider, like I do, anybody. Look at what he talks about. Consider what he says, like you do corporate media or anybody else. Come to your own conclusions, hopefully, about all of it. Don't just lean into the big time, the kind of people like this, because you'll tend to be behind the story and be misinformed, in my opinion, whether that's intentional or not. The point is that a lot of us were on this story, just like we are about Israel right now, and I'll bet you they're going to swing in late about that as well. There's a game that's being played, whether they know that or not. It's not being played by us. Now, I also want to point out an amazing article that Derek put out on the 21st. Saudi Arabia, the petrodollar, China, and the CBDCs. Now, the point here is simply, myself included, by the way, just in a passing coverage of this, I highlighted the story that was going around about the end of the petrodollar. Come to find out that technically was important, and I, to a degree, even in my passing coverage, I made this point slightly about the idea of the deal expiring. But my point at the time, before I say what Derek covered, is that my point was that, well, like the U.S., regardless of this, is not going to stop coercing people to maintain this control, right? I think that's the main point. Derek simply just in doing his due diligence, as he does, as somebody you should follow both here and in Conscious Resistance, turns out it didn't really end at all, in fact. Now, the deal has expired. And look, I like many people have highlighted over the years that the dollar is rapidly declining around the world. And that's largely because of your government weaponizing that influence through the petrodollar, through the reserve currency, to sanction countries and manipulate them financially. But this is a massive step in that direction. But my point is that it does not appear that it's actually over at all, despite most of the corporate media, shocker, right, blindly following suit, reporting whatever the story was, because it was hot. At the end of the day, that's why he covers China, CBDCs, and Saudi Arabia. It seems, my take on this might even be that one of the games here is that the whole point was to distract you over to this, genuine decline, but to hide the fact that Saudi Arabia is working with China. And what was it? The M Bridge? Yeah, M Bridge is a project. M Bridge is a project about basically creating cross-national borders, the ability to use CBDCs across national borders. So and the United States and Saudi Arabia seem to be in the same track here. So I feel like this is sort of a bait and switch, if you will. So just consider that and just realize that it's, always question what the corporate media says. Well, question what everybody says, but the corporate media, especially when they all come out in some rapid push for a story, tells you something. Doesn't mean it's fake, but it tells you that there's a reason they want you looking in that direction. So just recognize this story. I think it's important. And then Robert, put out this really hard to read story, but it's worth your time to understand this is happening. And this is about the West Bank. It's about settlers in the West Bank. And as he titles it, consistently use arson attacks to burn Palestinians alive. Now, the arson attacks are happening in regard to the buildings. They're burning people out middle of the night, sleeping in their homes, set their house on fire. Nobody seems to care about that. Not the rules-based international order, that's for sure. The problem is that, well, that's the problem. But on top of that, there's been many examples, one that goes back post-October 7th, to burning people alive. Children, mind you. That's the image you're looking at here. This is a story that goes before October 7th. This infant was burned alive. And then you've got the settlers, and it's a famous story, who were running around chanting, "Ollie's on the grill," at the families who were coming to deal with this in regard to court. Laughing, chanting, jeering them. Your child's burned alive. Ha, ha, ha. That's what we're talking about. Not a joke. This was Times of Israel reporting this. It's easy to prove. That's what we're dealing with here. Not every Jew or Israeli, but clearly Zionists, in my opinion. But these are the illegal settlers, which are some of the worst. There's the video. You can see it. Always on the grill, stabbing a picture of the children that were burned alive, stabbing them, tearing the pictures. Hatred, guys, hatred. And then projecting that hatred on every Palestinian, which I guarantee many of them have hatred back for what we're talking about here, for illegal occupation, for land theft and ethnic cleansing. Shocker. But what's crazy to me is how many don't. How many, in fact, actively rise above that and try to seek something like a two-state solution. But the point that started this was this story, which did come out recently again, I think June 14th-ish, around that time. But it wasn't from that time period, which I'm glad it's getting more attention. But this is October 9th. This was Mint Press News. This was a child that settlers in the West Bank grabbed, threw down, lit him on fire. This you can see. He was burned badly. Had to go to the hospital. You can listen. It's hard to listen to. He's wincing in pain, and it's horrible, horrible. But I want you guys to recognize that this is what we're talking about, and this is what your governments and the international community even seem to ignore, other than certain pockets that converse about this. Now, let's get into the conversation of what happened in Crimea, because you'll see how important this is to the larger conversation about not just the gladio-B overlap, not just about the idea of what your governments are supporting around the world and acting like they're fighting the bad guys when all of the worst of humanity seems to be the ones that they're supporting right now, but also about the excuse that was used, the unbelievable excuse about bombing a beach in broad daylight with children everywhere and claiming there's no civilians because it's this location. Now, remember, we're talking about Crimea here. Crimea was the argument that Russia seized and occupied this territory is embarrassingly false. But so is a lot of stuff that the governments of the United States continue to scream, like Assad gassing children and, whatever, everything. Bolivia, Venezuela, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, all of the lies they spin about what our WMDs. How often we can see them get caught in these lies, or Israel every day, or Ukraine nonstop. But we still just pretend, or rather, the mainstream media puts the veneer over, pretends it's not happening. What we're talking about is the bombing of children on these beaches, claiming that they're all human shields because, well, it's occupied territory, which is interesting and a reverse about the idea of what occupied territory. Like, it's just, it's like they're all trying to make themselves a benefit from the situation and really ruining it for all of them, for Israel, the United States, and Ukraine. This is going to expose everything that really has already been exposed. And I'll show you why. But realizing that Crimea was actually a referendum, and they voted near unanimously to go, high 90%, to go to Russia. Let's not forget, these are predominantly Russian-speaking people. So is the Donbass. That's why they gravitate in that direction. And on top of that, which is easy to prove, you go back before the Ukrainian coup forward for the most part, and you can see them bombing, attacking, ethnically cleansing. And then suddenly they're like, they're fighting to go back with those people? No, Russia's not doing that to them, despite all the narratives about Russia. Not the Donbass, not Crimea. And you can prove that the Azov movement, the rest of their neo-Nazi elements have been going after these groups because they speak Russian. And then the whole game is that they're supposed to be wanting to go back to that. It doesn't make any sense. So let's talk about how this all happened in this area. And it's not even the first time, mind you. This is Bricks News, highlights this. Just in, Russia says a deliberate terrorist missile attack was carried out on the city of Sevastopol by 5 American, I believe it's a town pronounced ATACMS, which seems like a really strange acronym for me. It reminds me, it doesn't make sense. It's a stupid comparison. It reminds me of that movie Australia for some reason, like the way that kid talks. But it's ATACMS, missiles equipped with clustered warheads. American missiles, yet again, just like every other field we seem to check out, because you know why? The United States are merchants of death around the world. They are selling weapons to the worst people in the world and acting like they're fighting for freedom. Except when Iran sends weapons to their allies, that's terrorism. Don't look any further, because we say they are, despite any evidence to the reality of what you claim about what they're doing in that terrorism. Leading state sponsor of terrorism, we're told. And then ISIS attacks them. Oh, so the leading terrorist group in the world attacks them, but they're the leading sponsor. Okay, that makes sense, right? No, it doesn't at all. But it says 4 U.S.-made ATACMS missiles were intercepted. The detonation, and this is all just what they're reporting. For all we know, they always get the game of how many were intercepted and how many weren't. But it says the detonation of the fragmentation warhead of the 5th U.S.-made missile in midair resulted in numerous casualties among civilians in Sevastopol. All flight assignments for U.S. ATACMS operational tactical missiles are entered by U.S. specialists based on the U.S.'s own satellite intelligence data. There is no way you decouple the U.S. government from this act. It says, therefore, responsibility for the deliberate missile strike on civilians in Sevastopol lies primarily with the U.S. government, especially since what's going on in Ukraine is simply a proxy element of both the U.S. and Israel, I argue, but the West in general, which supplied these weapons to Ukraine and with the Zelensky regime, for whose territory this strike was carried out. Such actions, will not go unanswered. And now this is coming directly from Russia. And believe me, or believe that when they're talking that this, let me put it this way. It's rare that you get this kind of a straightforward state, like that they're like, this will be responded to. Especially from Russia, who has shown incredible restraint over the years to the bombings in Syria, the bombings that have continued to happen in Russia from Ukraine. But this is an especially harsh one. And the reality is that they're saying you did this, U.S. government, and your actions will not go unanswered. It genuinely worries me what this will spin out into. But first, realize, and this is my point about restraint, this is not the first time. Oh, actually, here's Russia embassy in the UK reporting this. 5 people, including 3 children, killed. 124 civilians were injured as a result of their attacks in Sevastopol. This was yesterday at exactly 12:15. They're reporting a terrorist strike, and it's the point, right? They'll call it a response in war, when they'll call it a terrorist strike, and it's just the terminology, as always. When, quite frankly, I don't know why you wouldn't call this a terrorist act, no matter what government's involved, or any act like it. Indiscriminately attacking civilians over the guise that they're just not allowed to be civilians while this is happening, or Israel bombing an entire civilian refugee camp, that's terrorism, guys. That's what that is. Or the U.S. government doing it anywhere else in the world, or any other government. If ISIS does it, that's also terrorism. The point is, it's not unique to the color of your skin or where you're from. But it says the terrorist missile strike by 5 U.S.-made ATACMS operational missiles. This we just read. The American specialists, same point. This is why it says Washington is most responsible for the deliberate missile strike at peaceful residents in Sevastopol by delivering this weaponry to Ukraine, as well as the Kiev regime, from the territory of which the strike was launched. Now, here's my point. This is not even new in regard to restraint. Here's September 13th. Ukraine launches missile attack on Crimea. And Russia has been engaging with this war, but they're not. The fact that this has become more of a focal point, I think, is just the straw that broke the camel's back. This was on November 1st. Ukrainian-made drones carry out unprecedented attack on Russian warships in Sevastopol, but it wasn't just their warships, mind you. You can read about it. This is a port, right? Other civilian aspects were bombed. Here's Che Bose highlighting U.S. ATACMS cluster munitions, which is generally what we're getting reports on, the idea that they had cluster munitions on the munitions themselves, or the projectile, rather. They strike Russian civilians on a beach near Sevastopol. A U.S. recon drone had been scouted in the area. 5 are dead, including children. The point being that we can now have the overlap of a U.S. drone being caught on radar scouting the area before it happened. I don't think this is an accident, obviously. Now, here's the part that really blows me away. And the credit for this goes to foreign agent intel. I find this guy to be very insightful, despite the fact that he gets mostly framed as a one-side, Russian shill or whatever. But I find him to be quite objective, quite honestly. This is the advisor to the head of the office of President Zelensky. He justified this bombing of civilians on a beach because he's taking a page out of Israel's book and essentially claiming that they were all human shields. This is what our governments are supporting. Now, for instance, quick overlap to the point I was making the other day about online. If I were to have put human shields in quotes, that would be stupid and wrong because they don't say human shields. Just because I know that's what they're saying does not make it journalistically sound to put it in quotes. Hopefully that makes sense, just for all the people that were screaming I was wrong about this guy who was misquoting what people were saying. That's important, guys, and it does get more reach if you think they actually said a certain thing. But here's what he actually said. There are not and cannot be any beaches, in quotes, tourist zones, and other fictitious signs of peaceful life in Crimea. Why, he says? Because it's definitely a foreign territory occupied by Russia, where there are hostilities and a full-scale war. But that's not accurate when we're talking about a lot of the areas that are not on the front line of what's happening here. And even if it was, or is your suggestion that because you're at war with this entity, they're not allowed to have time think about the suggestion there. Even if it was actually occupied by Russia illegally. Your argument is because Russia did X, Y, and Z that no civilian is allowed to have fun on a beach? Otherwise, I mean, this is what these guys are lunatics. I think this is a clumsy attempt to kind of latch on to the argument Israel's getting away with, at least in the minds of the media and some of the governments. But he says again, Crimea is definitely, which it's not, a foreign territory occupied by Russia. When they voted for it, it's pretty clearly not an occupied territory. But it says where there are hostilities in full-scale war, the very war that Russia unleashed, which they did not, for genocidal and invasive purposes only, which is not true. So, I mean, these guys are just like Israel's people are. They'll just type out some things on Twitter. Doesn't have any meaning other than you stating what you want the narrative to be. The easily proven reality based on multiple angles of this, including many international observers, including many people from both sides of the conversation that completely acknowledge that, yes, it was a referendum, and yes, they voted, and it's pretty damn unanimous. But they just lie. Not hard to recognize these days. But it says Crimea is also a large military camp and warehouse. Well, let's just say that's true, which is technically now Russian territory, right? A crime. But here's what's important. The beach they bombed is not a military installation. Just by saying that in this general city that there are military installations, which, by the way, we'll get to the point about Israel using Tel Aviv as basically a human shield, doesn't mean you can just murder civilians in broad daylight because, well, Crimea has a military base. These people I don't think they truly understand the argument they're making. I think they're lazy and clumsily arguing this to kind of just make it like Israel's claim. But it says, which the Russians are cynically trying to hide and cover up with their own civilians. And there's the point. That's human shield. That's what that means. If you're using your civilians to mask your military presence, well, that would be the argument of human shields. It's not the truth here. Which in turn are considered to be, they use the term civilian occupiers. That's my point. That challenges your point, man, and I don't think they understand it. That's my point about these are the people both in Israel, Zionist government, and the neo-Nazi Azov movement, right sector, crazy government of Ukraine. These are not people that have earned what they have. They're not even that bright when it comes to policy, these are tools. These are proxies. They are useful instruments for other dangerous people. So my point is when you come out and go, they're being used as human shields, so now they're civilian occupiers, you just ruined your own point. All you really did, because the point is regardless of whether or not they're used as human shields, doesn't make them immediate legal targets. The whole game they play is that they're allowed to go after the guy using them as human shields, and they're going to do their best to avoid the human casualties. They're simply going, we're going to kill them all because they're occupiers now. Occupiers. So now they're the occupier, which gives you the right to arm resistance. Like they're trying clumsily and failing to make that point. But this is what just happened. This is what they're acknowledging. This is the 24th. Do you think your government's going to care? You think the world's going to stand up and go, that's against international law? No, they're going to hope you don't see it. They're going to ignore it. Here is what foreign intel agent had to say about this, and he's got a lot of great points on this. He says, U.S. involvement will definitely have consequences, or rather, that's deciding that's what Russia was saying. And it does seem quite concerning. All right. Well, give me a moment. Whatever just happened that last time just happened again. I have to delete all the videos and re-add them back. Good times. Welcome to the life of the last American vagabond. Okay. Here we go.
Today is Monday, the 24th of June, and I'll do my best to give you an overall brief of the chaotic events that have transpired in the past 48 hours. Yesterday was Sunday, which was a key day. It's not just a religious day, but a day of rest. One where the people of Sevastopol were targeted as they enjoyed their weekend on the beach. At the time of the launch of 5 ATACMS missiles, reportedly, according to open intelligence sources, a RQ-4B Global Hawk US Air Force drone was operating in the area, providing GPS information and coordinating the strike. Now, these ATACMS missiles, if they had intended to perhaps strike a Russian warship of the Black Sea Fleet or the operational headquarters of the Russian Navy, as they have in the past, you would expect them to be loaded with bunker-busting or high-explosive payload. In this case, it appears, as evidenced by a video that was released around the time of the incident, that cluster munitions were used. Now, in true terrorist style, and much like Matthew Miller of the US administration, Mikhail Podolyak has justified this attack, given that it's not an attack against civilians. It's therefore not terrorist because there are not and cannot be any beaches, tourist zones, and other fictitious signs of peaceful life in Crimea. Crimea is a large military camp and warehouse with hundreds of direct military targets, which the Russians are cynically trying to hide and cover up with their own civilians, which in turn are considered to be civilian occupiers. So there we have it. So in Goebbels fashion, Podolyak is trying to turn ordinary human beings into militants somehow by calling them civilian occupiers. And again, this seems to be a tactic straight out of the US playbook, where either complete denial that civilians exist, as Matthew Miller did with Belgorod, and in this case, Podolyak saying, well, they deserve to die because they're in proximity to military targets. Similar to what we're seeing in Gaza, quite frankly, where Israel will say, wow, all these people that were blown up as collateral damage, it serves them right for being in proximity to a Hamas leader, or someone we believe to be. But the chaos continued with Dagestan. The latest information that I have from there is the death toll from the attack has risen to 20 dead.
Now, this is an interesting overlap. This is about a synagogue that was attacked in Russia. Now, my personal opinion, I'll give after this. I mean, similar to what he's highlighting here. But I want to be clear that it's my personal opinion. At this point, though, I think we should be very, very, very skeptical about any of these kind of events that seem to immediately benefit the larger agenda. But that doesn't mean we should assume that they mean what we think they do. This could very well just be, I mean, quite frankly, it could be the thing that we hope it could be people that are attacking Jewish people just because they've bought the Zionist narratives, right? They've leaned into, like, the whole point of Zionism is trying to create the hatred towards Jewish people in order to justify existence. So that could be the case. It very well could be. Maybe there's just people that just hate them and they're trapped by the agenda. But my concern is that this is something much darker, false flag territory kind of thing. But it's certainly not something we should ever dismiss. But if we don't know for sure, we should not argue one way or the other, but we should be able to discuss the different possibilities. But the timing of this, hard to miss.
46 people injured. A brief overview of what we know about it was militants fired at a Russian Orthodox church and a synagogue. Now, not only did they fire at this church and set it ablaze, the Russian Orthodox Church was singled out, and the Father Nikolai was specifically targeted, according to intelligence sources, in a closed chat. His picture was pinned. The terrorists entered this Orthodox church, again, being a religious holiday and Sunday, where Father Nikolai would known to be working, killed the security guard and cut the throat of the priest.
That's wild.
Now, that's no accident, in my opinion. That was intended to be a barbaric slaughter.
That's crazy. No matter what, whatever happened, that should be condemned across the board. Obviously, the bottom line is that it was a shock action to me. Right. And I think there was something about that, about trying to make this and I think the story ends up falling into the larger conversation of the West, which is interesting because I'm not seeing this get that much attention, but you'd think, I bet you it will, about the conversation that these people are, that it's just another act of aggression against Jewish people around the world because Israel's fighting for its existence. Like that feels like the argument here, especially as we can see the Ukraine actions, right, happening in Sevastopol using Israel's narrative about human shields. And let's not forget that Israel funds the Ukrainian militants, Azov movement specifically.
To enrage, to really call out and horrify and strike fear into the local population. We've seen CIA meddling in Dagestan much at the beginning of the special military operation, where we saw agitation. I believe there was a protest of wives around the time of mobilization. Back in 2023, I believe in September, around that time. So we see this intent to cause division straight out of the playbook of the First and Second Chechen Wars, where the US tried to stir up trouble there and failed. And again, I share the sentiment that they will fail once again in Dagestan. There's also a bit of a intrigue about the mayor, who 2 of his sons, I believe, were involved. Now, he claims that this was a source, his radical sons and their radicalization was a source of family dispute, and yet, despite knowing for years that they were involved in these groups, said nothing to the authorities.
So there's an interesting overlap to the local government, right? And so I think at the end of the day, or at least local, power structure, and let's not forget that Israel has a lot of influence in Russia. So I think it's just something to consider, especially as we go through the other points after this that I think add to it.
Implying that he was, in fact, complicit in their actions. Now, two of the terrorists were eliminated in Machakala, and 2 were detained on the beach. Subsequently, residents have been asked to stay home and public events have been cancelled. But it wasn't just in Dagestan either. If we go to some of the less publicized events that took place, another area of unrest in Russia, I say Russia, but in the regions of the former Soviet Union is Abkhazia, where on the border there was a fatal shooting. 1 person was killed and 3 were injured in the Gagra region of Abkhazia, which is close to the Russian-Abkhaz border. This is according to the prosecutor's office there. We have some footage and some pictures where it's claimed unknown people opened fire on the border of Russia and Abkhazia near the checkpoint on the Pso River. This is according to MK with reference to Abkhaz telegram channels and eyewitnesses. And as it states, at the time 1 was killed, 1 was wounded, which has since gone up. But today, it has been reported that a fire in Moscow has erupted in a building which is involved in research and the manufacture of electronics. This is at the Platan Research Institute in Fryazino, near Moscow. The institute's developments contributed to the development of many branches of the defense industry, converter CRTs, high-speed potentialoscopes for various radar systems, including for suppressing passive interference from ground, aircraft, and ship radars, as well as...
And what's interesting to me on that is the overlap to Israel's wildly aggressive efforts to overtake the tech industry. So that all the time, what I'm really doing here is just thinking about the connections that what might be there. It's all hypothesizing. What's interesting, though, is the timing and all these things happen right around one another, and the idea that all of them do seem to, in a way, benefit that same agenda. It's just interesting, nonetheless. But, question everything.
Highlighting weak signals against a background of noise and converting television images from space in systems control of space objects, such as lunar rovers. So, whether this is a coincidence, I leave that up to you to decide, but it does appear that there is a concerted effort. Now, one of my first instincts was this may follow from Putin's visit to North Korea and Vietnam, which, as I've reported on Telegram, has been a black eye for the West, has significantly angered Washington. That being said, though, I don't believe this operation in Dagestan was something that was triggered overnight. It was at least a month in preparation. It may well have had its date brought forward, but that would have taken some coordination by the intelligence services of the West to enact. The ATACMS strike, well, yeah, that could have been coordinated and coincided, but whether it was a political backlash for the successful geopolitical victory that Putin has earned in Asia, in Vietnam and North Korea, I don't know. But we do see these acts of sabotage and terrorism increasing. And importantly, in a statement from the Kremlin, particularly in relation to this terrorist attack in Dagestan, which shares many traits and hallmarks of what I reported with the Crocus attack, namely the division based upon religion, this daubing of passages of the Quran upon the Orthodox Church intended to incite hatred and cause division. And see,
the important point here is many overlaps in history. I think Chechnya, plenty of examples where the game was to fake this stuff, and I'm talking about provable realities of the past, in order to create the division between the Muslim and Christian community, between the government and the Muslim community, and this is coming from a very Zionist agenda perspective. Right? Just same things like dragging U.S. into wars in the Middle East. This is about creating the perception as opposed to just that being the current reality. That's not to say that we know for sure that that's what this is, but it's a likely possibility in my mind that we have to consider that this is an ongoing agenda.
Statement from the Kremlin reads that Russian President Vladimir Putin on Sunday constantly received reports and gave instructions in connection with the events in both regions. The leader deeply sympathizes with the relatives of the victims, and Russia fully understands who is behind, specifically the barbaric missile attack on Sevastopol, and US involvement in hostilities that results in deaths of Russian civilians will definitely have consequences, it reads. Russia has received no telegrams of condolence from unfriendly nations, nor have there been any words of condemnation from their side about what happened in Dagestan. Indeed, with Crocus, we actually saw jubilation and gloating from the Western powers. Whether we see that this time with Dagestan remains to be seen. But I think suffice to say that if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. That's about a wrap of the news that I have.
Yeah, it's hard to disregard that, right? I think he's doing a good job on this, and I'm going to follow up. I think this is going to be a story that will be worthy of following up, but it's pretty interesting. Now, here's an interesting overlap as well. So coming from the idea that we have the narrative being set by the advisor to the head of Zelensky and outlining that essentially we did kill all these civilians, right? But they were legal targets, I guess, is the argument they were trying to clumsily make and failing wildly. So that's clear. I mean, they've all but taken complete credit for doing so. But let's not forget on top of that, we talked about this at the time. Adam sharing this. Remember when an Israeli government minister on RT told Russia they will pay for supporting Palestine? And he just says, now Mossad keeps attacking Russia with false flag terror attacks. That's his opinion. But we know some of these have happened. We can prove Israel overlap to some of these previous, or even the idea of U.S. military vehicles, helicopters taking Azov or other Ukrainian elements into Russia to carry out attacks. That was covered by the Times in the UK. My point is that we've seen them facilitating these actions in wildly illegal ways, at least more so, it's not technically illegal. The point is they're just not pretending they're involved. But what they're doing is, I think, an unjust war in general. But in any case, the point is he's saying on the record that you'll pay for this support. Now, is that what we're talking about here? Is this the overlap? Are they carrying out a series of these attacks or false flags or whatever? And remember, false flag doesn't mean people didn't die. It could, but it simply means that you either carry something out, fake something, and you blame it, or you create the narrative that it is somebody else's fault. But remember, this is an important clip, but when he threatened Russia that they would pay for this.
I understand you are on the Russian payroll, and I understand this is a Russian propaganda, but you have to be very careful, because let me tell you, we're going to finish this war. We're going to win because we're stronger. After this, Russia will pay the price. Believe me, Russia will pay the price. Russia is supporting the enemies of Israel. Russia is supporting Nazi people who want to commit genocide on us, and just Russia will pay the price. Russia also. Now, listen to me.
Now, just quickly think about what we've seen people like this kind of rabid, this is a Zionist speaking right here. We've talked about this in the past. Rabid aggression, just complete disregard for any, what's the word for it? He feels entitled, right? Like he's knowing, and the bottom line is, do you think that what we've seen already, what you've seen the Israeli government and the most extreme Zionist elements carry out, allow, cheer on publicly, do you think this is outside their capability? Or do you think it's likely that they would be willing to carry something like this out? That's not to say even if it was likely that they did do it, but just ask yourself if that's first and foremost possible. Are they capable of doing this? And I think the answer is an unequivocal yes.
Very carefully. We are going to finish with these Nazis. We're going to win this war. It's going to take the time it's going to take, but we're going to win this war. Afterwards...
They've already lost, by the way, according to everybody, even Hagari and the rest. We're not going to defeat Hamas, right? So now add that to this person's frustration and anger. Right? Now what is he going to do? It only compounds that kind of action. Think Samson and these other thought processes of the Israeli government that, if we are even failing, maybe we should just take out everybody. That's the kind of mindset we get from a lot of these most extreme, unhinged people. And guess what? Their own people are calling that out now. We'll get to that about their own protesters saying, we need to not only end the war, get our hostages back, so which means take whatever deal they're offering, which is what they're saying. Screw Netanyahu and the war cabinet. We don't want them anymore. Take the government down is what they're talking about. Get rid of the extreme people, which is most of them anyway. But that's what the Israelis are saying on the ground to Israeli media. It's funny how you don't hear this in Western discussions, huh?
We're not forgetting what you are doing. We're not forgetting. We will come. We will make sure that Ukraine wins. We will make sure that you pay the price for what you have done. You as Russia, and you and as all the enemies of Israel, and you as all the people who are now making everything they can to support genocide of the Jews in Israel. We are not forgetting.
Oh, Instagram just censored our show. I'm going to make a point out of that every time. It's weird how they just keep censoring us without deleting the channel, but I don't know why anybody chooses to watch it there, but I make it live every time just because I like to make them censor it. But obviously this is too sensitive for them. He's openly threatening action here. He called him an enemy of Israel. So based on that argument, as an enemy of Israel, they can do whatever they want, according to what Israel said repeatedly about pretty much everything it's ever done. It's wild.
And not forgetting, remember exactly what I'm saying now. You will pay the price.
Amir, I think it's safe to say that this is a very passionate conflict that is happening here.
Well, people have been massacred. My people has been slaughtered by your proxies, and you will pay the price.
Wow, now they're a proxy, right? So I thought it was Iran's proxy. No, it's Russia, though, or whoever works for that moment, right?
Is it clear? Believe me,
no, I don't actually think it is clear.
Very, very, very sternly.
I don't think it is clear, Mr. Weidman, and I would suggest
then it should be
in the
clear.
future,
it should be clear.
As being a politician,
it should be clear to you, because you have to understand that actions have got consequences. And when people support murder of Jews, people pay the price. This is true in Gaza. This is true everywhere else. The time that Jews actually have no power to defend themselves is gone. And people will now have to bear the consequences of them supporting genocidal Nazis who are out to exterminate Jews. What we have seen 10 days ago is not something normal. We have seen these Nazis going out massacring people in the streets.
Nazis, complete different ideology, different everything, but Nazis because why not? Because that's the historical context that makes you guys hate whoever we point at, right? Even though you can show endless amounts of overlap to the Zionist government and historical Nazi conversations, actual Nazi overlap, or the Leahy party and their actual coordination with the Nazi party past the final solution, or, just their general genocidal actions and continued ethnic cleansing and racial supremacy. But, it's all these guys over here who are acting differently, think differently, don't have the same ideology, different skin color, but they're Nazi white supremacists. Never mind, not white. It's like, it's just so embarrassing the way they try to shoehorn in whatever now they're calling them like jihad Nazis, some really dumb statement. It's because they're desperate. That's why.
Babies, beheading them, older people.
Oh, beheaded babies. Remember, this is a while ago when they were still trying. I think some people still make that claim, even though it's the most obviously debunked narrative of the whole thing.
Women raping, all these things you've seen them.
Another claim that is now being shown to be flatly false.
How can you even dare to support the murderers? I tell you frankly.
And realize the point is, let me finish it.
The public opinion in Israel has changed. We are not now.
You're right, against them.
Where we were 10 days ago.
And the point is that he's talking about, what do you say right there?
Frankly, the public opinion to support the murderers.
Right. So what he's saying is, you support Palestinians, because that's what they said in the beginning, right? They didn't say we support Hamas. They're simply saying that he's saying because you support the Palestinians, you're going to pay. So are we confused about the fact that they're not fighting Hamas, that are fighting Palestinians, and they think they're all Nazis, right? It's clumsy how obvious all this is. Now, before we go forward on the next point, I just think it's funny to address the super chat in the live chat in Rumble, which I wish I could just give you your money back, because it's funny to me that everyone thinks we're secretly, wink, wink, talking about Jewish people. I mean, no matter how many times we make this point, and no matter how many times, you can sure as hell think that, and I can call you a racist, disgusting person for thinking it's only Jewish people. That's my free speech right. And it's your free speech right to give me money so you can say something online that makes people think that's what we're thinking, which is probably part of the agenda. We're talking about Zionists, who, by the way, are predominantly Christian in the world, but keep pretending it's about the one thing that makes this all work. I'm willing to bet this person in the chat is probably part of that agenda. There was a whole time where they were just dumping this in the chat, bombing chats and going, name the Jew. And it was, and you know who one of those guys are? The ridiculous handsome truth guy who was literally pictured next to Boneface out there with those Nazi flags. I mean, like, how stupid do they think we are? These are ploys, guys. The bottom line is it's easy to see that there is a clear problem with the ideology. And if most of them are Christians, how in the world are you going to pretend it's only about one religion? There's plenty of Jews that stand up and call this out right now. I guess those facts are too hard for you to wrap your mind around, but go ahead, think what you want. You have that right. But we also have a right to call you on your disgusting nature. That's free speech for you. And I hope you enjoy that. So let's go to the next point. I always do that with his name. Glenn Greenwald simply highlights the post and the bombing and just calls people out for continuing to act like this is not, like a couple things going around it, right? Acting like this is not, kind of ignoring it because you don't want to highlight that, or acting like this is just a part in the war against the bad, evil Russia. He simply says people who think that the monstrous risks evident from this tweet are worth it, meaning children killed and what they've been doing and the attacks they've carried out, all to keep a futile and pointless war going over who rules a few provinces in eastern Ukraine, have completely lost any sense of rationality or sobriety. Look at the deranged game you're playing. And he also highlights the clip that we just played, which I do think, I know we just touched on it, but I think it's actually important to play again for what this conversation is today. He says, people who believe the Russia-Ukraine conflict started in February 2022 are as historically ignorant as those who think Israel-Palestine started on October 7th. Exactly. And those who scoff at the risks of U.S.-Russia war are just mad. Listen to Professor Jeffrey Sachs explain history. And again, somebody made a great comment on this last time. That looks like this clip. It looks like Piers Morgan was, called to the front of the class. It's hilarious because he does. He looks like somebody getting schooled about things that he probably secretly knows and doesn't want to admit because he's not honest, in my opinion.
Seem very reliant on accepting Putin's worldview rather than perhaps the stark reality of the barbarism with which he's executed this war.
Yeah, maybe because I know too much about the United States, because the first war in Europe after World War II was the U.S. bombing of Belgrade for 78 days to change borders of a European state. The idea was to break Serbia, to create Kosovo as an enclave, and then to install Bondesteel, which is the largest NATO base in the Balkans, in the Southwest Balkans. So the U.S. started this under Clinton, that we will break the borders, we will illegally bomb another country. We didn't have any UN authority. This was a, quote, NATO mission to do that. Then I know the United States went to war repeatedly, illegally, in what it did in Afghanistan, and then what it did in Iraq, and then what it did in Syria, which was the Obama administration, especially Obama and Hillary Clinton, tasking the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and then what it did with NATO illegally bombing Libya to topple Muammar Gaddafi, and then what it did in Kiev in February 2014. I happened to see some of that with my own eyes. The U.S. overthrew Yanukovych together with right-wing Ukrainian military forces. We overthrew a president. And what's interesting, by the way, is we overthrew Yanukovych the day after the European Union representatives had reached an agreement with Yanukovych to have early elections, a government of national unity, and a stand down of both sides. That was agreed. The next thing that happens is the opposition, quote unquote, says we don't agree. They stormed the government buildings and they deposed Yanukovych. And within hours, the United States says, yes, we support the new government. It didn't say, oh, we had an agreement. That's unconstitutional what you did. So we overthrew a government, contrary to a promise that the European Union had made. And by the way, Russia, the United States, and the EU were parties to that agreement. And the United States, an hour afterwards, backed the coup. Okay, so everyone's got a little bit to answer for. In 2015, the Russians did not say, we want the Donbass back. They said peace should come through negotiations, and negotiations between the ethnic Russians in the east of Ukraine and this new regime in Kiev led to the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was voted by the UN Security Council unanimously. It was signed by the government of Ukraine. It was guaranteed explicitly by Germany and France. And you know what? And it's been explained to me in person. It was laughed at inside the US government. This is after the UN Security Council unanimously accepted it. The Ukrainians said, we don't want to give autonomy to the region. Oh, but that's part of the treaty. The US told them, don't worry about it. Angela Merkel explained in Die Zeit, in a notorious interview after the 2022 escalation, she said, oh, you know, we knew that Minsk II was just a holding pattern to give Ukraine time to build its strength. No, Minsk II was a UN Security Council unanimously adopted treaty that was supposed to end the war. So when it comes to who's trustworthy, who to believe, and so forth, I guess my problem, Piers, is I know the United States government. I know it very well. I don't trust them for a moment. I want these two sides actually to sit down in front of the whole world and say, these are the terms. Then the world can judge, because we could get on paper clearly for both sides of the world. We're not going to overthrow governments anymore, the United States needs to say. We accept this agreement, the United States needs to say. Russia needs to say we're not stepping 1 foot farther than whatever the boundary is actually reached. And NATO's not going to enlarge. And let's put it for the whole world to see. You know, once in a while, treaties actually hold.
And I doubt that will ever happen. Right. And even if it did, I can guarantee you after a certain period of time, one or both sides would eventually try to break it. The point, nonetheless, is that you have to recognize the history, the long-term, continual consistency of doing the wrong thing, of not only doing the wrong thing, but then screaming to the world about the thing you did it being right, which is what I keep highlighting lately. What I simply said is for us to understand right now, Americans in particular need to come to terms with the reality that the U.S. government, not the country, not the people, but the U.S. government is not what we pretend it is. Not for a long time now. If we can accept that fact, that the rest of the world learned the hard way long ago, change is possible. I believe that. Now, here is how corporate media, at least some of them, covered this story, or rather just covered the current reality. This was published today. How Ukraine's naval drones turn the tide in the Battle of the Black Sea. Unmanned vessels developed in the fight against Russia are a part of the revolution in modern warfare. Can you imagine the coverage it would be if this was Israelis that were killed, or in Ukrainians, or the reverse conversation? Like I mean, it's just amazing to me the blatant disregard for civilian lives from the rules-based international order if it just happens to be on the wrong side of the border. They're just disgusting people. Here's what Scott Ritter had to say about this. I think you should listen. He knows what he's talking about.
It's Sunday, and normally this is a day I like to take off and dedicate it to my family, but the events unfolding in Russia, I think, require at least some brief commentary. I'm referring to two events, actually. One, a Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol using U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles, and the second, a terrorist attack in Dagestan that appears to have all the hallmarks of Western involvement. Let there be no doubt, these are two direct attacks against Russia by proxies of the United States and of NATO. And it's more than just a proxy engagement, given the necessity of preparation, intelligence support, etc. This is a direct attack on Russia by the United States, by NATO, and by non-NATO European entities. All of the parties that have made a decision in the last several days and weeks to expand the scope and scale of their participation in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict.
Now realize that if he's saying this, you could be damn sure that Russia is aware of that. So think about the alarming step of taking this action in a way that guarantees Russia will be aware, as they've made clear that this is not just, I mean, not only a joint attack, but almost explicitly, as they keep framing it as, because of the use of the weapons and how they were saying that this is a U.S. attack. Like they're the ones leading that action. Now, even if that's wrong, that's how Russia has perceived this. And what Ritter is saying is that that is the reality. That's alarming, guys. Now, I'd like to believe that Russia has shown itself to be, strategically sound enough to recognize that that response is bad for everybody. But the problem is the Israels and USs of the world know that. And they're gambling with your lives knowing that, well, they're not dumb enough to push this into some further. So you're always banking on their restraint while framing them in the world as the lunatics. Seems to be the other way around. That's not good guy, bad guy. It's just stating the obvious, in my opinion.
Now, some people are saying that the Ukrainians deliberately attacked a beach in Sevastopol. The evidence shows that this most likely is not the case, that 5 ATACMS missiles were fired, 4 were shot down. The 5th one being shot down dispersed either cluster bombs or fragments from the destroyed missile onto the beach, killing a number of Russians, wounding many others.
Now, that's an important development in that. Now, I haven't been able to confirm that's his opinion, and it certainly is just as likely as anything else, but still would be the argument that they fired on civilian locations, and as they shot them down, one of them ended up hitting the beach right there. Nonetheless, they were still aimed at areas that were full of civilians, whether it was a Crimean military location or not. It's a civilian populated area. So it's an important difference. It would make a big difference in the conversation. So as this fleshes out, we'll have to make sure we follow up on whether that was the case or not. Nonetheless, it is still a U.S. attack with Ukraine on Russia, which is a big deal. But I'll wait to make this point about what Wikipedia shows you as Sevastopol.
But that doesn't matter. The Ukrainians made a decision to use ATACMS missiles equipped with cluster munitions against a city, a civilian city. This is an act of terrorism. This is in keeping with the Ukrainian actions that have transpired over the course of the past years, where Ukraine since 2014 has been bombarding Russian civilian sites, cities, villages, towns, for the sole purpose of inflicting death and destruction on Russian civilians. This is an act of terrorism. And given that the ATACMS missile cannot be deployed by the Ukrainians without extensive intelligence support by the United States, this is an act of terrorism by the United States against Russia. The same can be said about the attacks in Dagestan. These are deliberately designed to disrupt the civil life of the Russian Federation. Dagestan is part of the Russian Federation. And it's also designed to engender a split between the Muslim and non-Muslim segments of Russian society. This is a tactic that goes back to the first Chechen War and the second Chechen War, where the CIA and other European intelligence agencies sought to split Chechnya away from the Russian Federation. That effort failed, and the effort in Dagestan will fail too.
All at the expense of the very people they claim to be supporting. That is the one thread that I see throughout this country's history, the government history, using both us and the countries they claim to protect for their own seemingly nefarious interests, right? That division caused nothing but bloodshed and terrible things. And interestingly, overlaps even current today with the Azov movement. We saw early in this conversation Chechnyan elements of it that were dipping their bullets in pig fat, saying we're going to go kill all these Muslim orcs. That was like right in the first couple of weeks of this, and it just got disregarded, and it was posted on the Azov channel itself on Twitter. But totally not bad guys, though, right? I mean, it's very clear your government knows exactly what these people are, and they don't care.
But it doesn't absolve.
Better, actually, because they're the ones that are like that in general. Like more put it more accurately, they don't care because they are that.
The parties involved of their guilt in launching what is a direct assault on the Russian Federation. Now, the question is, what will Russia do? Historically speaking, the Russian Federation has shown an ability to absorb provocations of this nature and remain focused on the task at hand, which of course is achieving the goals of the special military operation, the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. But at some point in time, there will have to be a response. And what is an appropriate response? That's up for the Russian Federation to decide, but let there be no doubt that if and when the time comes for the Russian Federation to respond to all of those responsible for this horrific series of attacks, that the perpetrators held to account will not just be the Ukrainians, but those who have provided the Ukrainians with the weapons and the intelligence and the training to carry out these dastardly, cowardly attacks. We live in very dangerous times. We live at a time when Russia, the United States, and NATO have all been beating the nuclear drum. We don't need a nuclear war, but that's the direction we're heading if we don't stop this insanity. And by stopping this insanity, this means stopping the United States, stopping NATO, stopping Europe from continuing to facilitate these terrorist attacks by Ukraine against Russia. Have a great Sunday.
Now, even that, you can clearly argue, and I think it's self-evident, that he's not saying Russia's necessarily the good guy. Now, he may think that, but in the context of what he's saying, and I think this is just important, because I don't think it's important to get into the good guy, bad guy, childish kind of, binary narrative, because I think they all have examples of doing all sorts of terrible things. It simply highlights the fact that one of these entities has continued to show restraint, and the other one has continued to push those boundaries. I think that's very easy to see. I guess I'm sure people disagree. But I wanted to highlight this really quickly just because somebody was talking about this in the chat. And it is interesting to see that we have yet to see this kind of an overlap in warfare, even though it's very clear and prominent and possible. Vanessa Beeley and I back in 2020 had this conversation. Evidence points to EMP in what mainstream media, DHS, call a new 9/11-like threat. Just interesting to think about. People in the chat were simply going like, what about that possibility? And since it was brought up, I'll throw this in the show notes. I find kind of hard to believe this, surprising rather, that this has not become something that's more prominent. I'm surprised, but maybe it's because like the deep fake game, it's been there for a long time. There's just people waiting to pull that card. But here's what, if you look Sevastopol up, or rather even just Crimea, port city in Ukraine. Oh, is it? It's the largest city in Crimea. I mean, this is why Wikipedia is not a valid source. It's very easy to manipulate. It simply shows you mass adoption, usually forced through the controlled government narratives, right? And that's important to think about. But what's crazy about this is that it's been a long time. I mean, even if you want to call it an occupied territory, which it's not, it wouldn't be part of Ukraine by any stretch of the imagination. So it's just embarrassing. So the point is, you're getting this weird coverage of the story because their own narratives are completely broken. But here is where I think this gets especially important to think about. Whether we're talking about inside of Russia, inside the United States, inside of Israel, inside of the UK, anywhere, there has been a long-term agenda that's been going on for, decades, if not longer. I mean, honestly, I would argue going back long even before the creation of the United States, or this is just simply an idea of creating internal sort of, what's the term? Counterinsurgency. Well, no, I guess counterinsurgency would be if you're, anyway, just forces internal that you can kind of embed and then appear to be natural, but then are used to either cause chaos or destabilization or begin regime change. And this is something the U.S. government has been proven to be behind. And James Corbett's talking with Abby Martin all the way back on her, on the set? What was it again? Breaking the Set, her show on RT back in the day, 2013, and talking about what this was and what they've used it for. And I think what we're talking about is how this has been continued. The Azov movement, moderate rebels, I mean, as far back, anywhere you want to look, the Mujahideen, like there's many angles and aspects of this in between all of that. Even the Kurds, for example, you could argue, were some kind of a force that was developed for the very interest of creating their own station, rather, I would argue more so manipulating their own nation ambitions, only to use them time and again to manipulate another country and then leave them hanging out to dry. Or Guaido in Venezuela, or these different, and now these aren't the best examples of gladio-B. I would argue more so like an Azov movement, long-term, creating the force that then becomes a central part of the internal, but is actually manipulated from the outside. But I want you to think about this across all that we're talking about, whether it's Hamas or anything else, or just what your governments have done around the world. This is important to think about.
I've briefly touched upon the shady tactics used by the governments to foment public support for war. One such program by the U.S. was put in place during the Cold War, called Operation Gladio, the aim of which was to have paramilitary organizations stay behind in the Eastern Bloc to continue the destabilization of regional powers. And although the program was finally acknowledged in 2006 and is said to be long over, some allege that it never really ended. Instead, this clandestine operation simply morphed to fit the needs of the war on terror. Here to help me break down this very important and convoluted subject is James Corbett, independent journalist and host of the Corbett Report. Thanks for coming on, James.
Thank you for having me, Abby.
So what did Operation Gladio consist of, and how far-reaching was the program?
Now, really quickly, just want to highlight that this is my point about today, that you see very few people bringing on the objective, nonpartisan researchers. That's why one of the reasons I respect Abby in a lot of ways. Right? I mean, there's people like James Corbett and a lot of different people out there that I argue are just simply nonpartisan and very objective, are more by the day boxed out of even independent media. There's a reason for that.
Well, you were recently on the program talking about the top 5 conspiracies that turned out to be true, and I think Operation Gladio has to rank up there among them. Gladio is the code name for a clandestine operation that, as you indicate, was set up by NATO in conjunction with the CIA in the wake of World War II as the Cold War started to develop. And the official cover of this program was that it was designed as a stay-behind program to fund, train, equip, supply, and otherwise facilitate groups to be ready in the case of a Soviet invasion of Europe. And if that were to happen, basically these groups would be able to resist the Soviet occupation forces while NATO prepared some sort of military response. That was at least the official cover for what was happening.
Well, let's talk about that transition. I mean, very shocking. I didn't even really understand the extent of Operation Gladio until I was watching your series. I recommend everyone to check that out. Really thorough series, just basically outlining everything that this operation was. As you said, I mean, it's a decades-long operation that consisted of false flag, terror attacks, death, the funding of ultra-nationalist groups to foment terrorism. Let's talk about the transition into gladio-B. You said that there's evidence showing that this is actually still happening today, and it's actually morphed into something else. What is that, and what evidence is there to back that up?
But in the mid-1990s, Operation Gladio started to shift from that funding of paramilitaries and ultranationalist groups in Turkey specifically towards an operation more like what we saw in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where the U.S. specifically was funding and helping and training and arming the Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And this became the model for what's known as gladio-B. Gladio-B is the term that Sibel Edmonds indicates is the actual FBI file that they have on this, the information on this in the FBI. But there is a different name for whatever office in the Pentagon actually works with NATO on this operation. That's still classified. We don't know that, but we do know that it's referred to as gladio-B by the FBI. And basically, this is the cooperation of NATO and U.S., including high-ranking U.S. State Department officials and others, with Islamic terrorists, basically, in the perpetuation of a strategy of tension, which can be used as a type of weapon against, specifically in Central Asia and the Balkans, and the Central Asia and the Caucasus region, which is an exceptionally important part of the global chessboard, as Zbigniew Brzezinski talks about. And in fact, in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, he identified Central Asia as the absolute key for anyone who wants to have world dominance in this day and age needs to control Central Asia. And that's where we find a lot of these operations now are being based, with U.S. and NATO officials cooperating with Islamic terrorists in order to foment a type of destabilization that is aimed ultimately against rivals Russia and China.
Now, think about this in the overlap with what we just talked about happening in Russia. a government and an entities and the neo-Nazi elements that are funded by Israel, which we'll get into next, as well as the United States, or the Ritter Point in Chechnya and the overlap therein. Like, this is happening, guys. They're using this to foment the division, which right now, nowhere in the world is there more of an obvious agenda than Zionism trying to foment that same divide to justify its existence. We saw the push from everyone in corporate media to tell you this dark cloud of anti-Semitism have come over the United States, and it turns out near everything they've tried to accuse turned out to be a false story, a lie. Stefanik and the rest of these people screaming about things that the police said weren't true. People getting stabbed in the eyes with flags that turned out to be a complete hoax over and over and over. It's just not to say there's not anti-Semitism or racism. It's always existing in some ways in the world about every group. But that's not to say that this was some kind of an overwhelming problem. It wasn't real. They lied about it. And if they have to lie about it so aggressively, it clearly shows you that they're not actually, it's not really what's happening. So this is a problem that we can see that they've been doing for a very long time. And you could argue that all the way back then goes to the same point.
Right. Very fascinating. I remember in the video series you're talking about right before 9/11, I think 1997 to 2001. I mean, we're talking about al-Zawahiri, alleged top al-Qaeda officials being flown out, fostered by NATO, propagated by NATO and also the CIA and covert forces in the area. You said that this is actually going on still to this day. What are they doing? And explain really how this manifested into perpetuating what we're seeing play off across that region of the world right now.
Well, you're exactly right about that. And again, this comes directly from Sibel Edmonds, who was working directly with the information from the FBI that Ayman al-Zawahiri was meeting with top-level U.S. officials in Baku, Azerbaijan in 1997 to 2001, in that range. And this is important because for people who don't know, Ayman al-Zawahiri was, of course, Osama bin Laden's right-hand man and is now the nominal head of al-Qaeda itself. So the fact that he had such high-level contacts for so many years with in the heart of the U.S. State Department and with high-ranking officials is an exceptionally big story, for obvious reasons. And the fact that this is still ongoing, I think, is certainly viewable in the context of what's happening in that Central Asia Caucasus region with countries of such importance geostrategically like Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Right. And so we're talking about overlaps, not just 9/11. Right. But the entire kind of war on terror, Muslim threat, like we can clearly see, as we now can look back and know, or even at the time, that Israel was aggressively involved with driving that into reality. The point that I've made many times over the last, for a while, there's only two things that seem the U.S. government, left and right, seem to completely act in unison around. And that's Israel and war, and seem to always go to war for Israel's interests. And I think what we're seeing there is obvious examples of creating the boogeyman. In fact, the surreptitious action of actually arming and funding and driving them into reality so they can be turned around and pointed at. We've talked about this with the war on terrorism in general, Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabist elements, or going all the way back to the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, which then became Al-Qaeda, which became ISIS, which is the same game. And the point that we can prove that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the overlaps are their proxy elements, which is probably why they're continuing to make these arguments elsewhere. I'll highlight James Corbett's our watch along of his 3-part documentary, This Secret History of Al-Qaeda, which if you have not seen, I guarantee will blow your mind. Not just like, oh, something to think about, but you get done and go, wow, I did not know it was that easy to prove. Sort of like everything we're talking about around Israel, guys. People are truly, for whatever reason, and I've explained why I think it is, waking up to things that have always been there. And then you've got the gatekeepers out there trying to mire you and have truths to keep you keeping the status quo going. It's all there if you care enough to look. Now, what this overlaps with, obviously, as we've showed many times, the article from 2018, Haaretz, rights groups demand Israel stop arming neo-Nazis in Ukraine. That's the Azov movement. We've talked about this many times. It's not hard to recognize. That only is confusing unless you understand the true history of Zionism. They're literally arming the obvious neo-Nazi elements in the world. And that's not confusing to people. Like, it's clearly a contradiction to what they claim they are. And they're arming them for a reason. Now, whether you think it's because that's ultimately what they are behind themselves, or the history of their overlapping with these Nazi elements, which is the clear, provable reality, or it's just them funding the thing they want to point at to justify their own existence as Zionism, or they're just doing it to manipulate an area for their own benefit. Either way, we're talking about arming and funding and quietly supporting the worst elements in the world. That's what they talk about in regard to the war on terror, as they claim they're fighting Muslim terror and threaten all of Islam, as the loomers of the world will screech at you about the only thing that matters, except you forget the part of the story where Israel and the U.S. are actually funding those elements, which is easy to prove. Funding the worst elements of the very thing they claim they're fighting. That's gladio-B kind of stuff we're talking about. At the same time, it's very clear to see that the peoples of these countries, the moderate elements of them, just didn't want to bow to whatever they demanded of them, were a problem for what they wanted to accomplish, whether that's about foreign policy and geostrategic control or the resources they wanted to mine from the mountains or whatever else. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, they chose to arm, fund, and support the very kind of thing in every seemingly country I can point to that they claim they were trying to stop. What a perfect model. You arm, you fund it, you grow it, you facilitate it through Israel, it seems, and then you point at it to justify more arms exchanges to all these countries and guaranteeing a long-term, except clearly it wasn't guaranteed as it all falls apart in front of you. But I'll include this as well about the documents from the CIA discussing this going back to 1948, which was them funding, creating a very clear fascist entity using the Ukrainian Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists, Mykola Lebed as a Nazi war criminal from Poland, setting him up with a prologue company, both in the United States and in Ukraine, to propagandize Americans with Nazi propaganda. Was that what they fought for? Apparently. It's all easy to prove right from CIA documents, which then became Azov movement and the rest of it. That's what you're watching. And the gladio-B overlap in the same point from a long time ago. Now, interestingly enough, Whitney Webb highlights this tweet from America First Legal that says, exclusive internal documents from the Biden's DHS show their plans to target Trump supporters as domestic extremists, which shouldn't surprise anybody. The war on domestic terrorism has been one of Biden's primary focuses. They say the Brennan Clapper Intel Group discussed how, quote, most of the domestic terrorism threat now comes from supporters of the former president. Is it the truth? I don't believe that. I think it's because that's what they want to frame it as, while supporting the actual, Patriot Front type of elements that we can clearly prove are directly over. And the reason I say we can prove that is because a lot of these points we've shown you from either the Blood Tribe or the Patriot Front or where these games are, there are people like Boneface that I can tie directly back to the Azov movement, which, by the way, is funded by Israel and the CIA. Not hard to see. This is gladio-B inside our own country by your governments. And the bottom line is, they're pointing at the people they politically don't like while funding the actual examples of what they claim they're fighting. It's the same thing everywhere. But here's what Whitney adds. Honestly, this was also happening under Trump's DHS, because it was, guys. And I think, honestly, was spearheaded by him, at least in the context as Whitney's covered it, and we can see it grow, but it probably, for all we know, started a long time ago. But it says, and under the William Barr-run DOJ, which also legalized pre-crime and used it on Americans over social media posts. Funny how the current Republican side of this doesn't acknowledge that clear discussion. It's like ignoring that Trump made the vaccine and blaming only Biden's administration. It's crazy. It says both parties advanced the war on domestic terror, which is really a war on dissent. And she includes the article. And, okay, I'll grab the original post here. I'll just open this one. She posted under a limited hangout. The original post is from TLAV, as it says, originally published. It is important who is a terrorist in Biden's America. It's a great article. It's important for you to read. The reality is very clear. It's pretty much what she's highlighting right there. Now, I'll also include January 6th was always a very clear government operation, because the point is exactly the same. The Azov movement, present, this Sergei Beninin, or I think that's what it was, Beninin or Sergei, something like that. The point is this guy right here, who is an Azov movement, we proved this many times over the years, is here pictured with Jake Chansley and on the record screaming, let's go in Russian. Because the whole point was using their funded elements to frame the Russian government as creating white supremacy in this country. Except you were using your funded Nazi elements that you created in Azov movement and filtering it through this whole conversation. And we also saw the Antifa, whatever, left-wing groups, which, by the way, same damn thing. You can try to make it only about the left versus the right, but it's not about that. It's bigger than that. It's your government funding elements anywhere on any side that can use to manipulate you. But it's all the same conversation, guys. We're watching this gladio-B conversation internally. That's important to me. So keeping all that in mind. Oh, I'll include this just because somebody in the chat said this. I'll include this for you guys. Just Stella Assange and apparently the WikiLeaks, which doesn't say that now for some reason. I don't know why Twitter always does this. I mean, I think we do know why. Hey, there's WikiLeaks right there. Watch it disappear. Oop, went away. Julian is free. Words can express our immense gratitude to you, yes, you who have all mobilized for years and years to make this come true. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, I have to look more into this. I want to make sure, that I know the full story and what's going on. I hope he's actually going to be free now. We'll see what happens. Look at him, man. That's crazy. It's wild. If that's actually what's happening, because that blows my mind. I never would have expected that's how this would go. We'll see what happens. I'm going to have Taylor hopefully look into this, cover the story since she's really, immersed in this overall. But I think it's a good thing. I mean, I think anybody really should, regardless of what you think. I think this not going the way it seemed like it was going to is a win for everybody. And it's showing you that they are losing control. But talking about Twitter and RFK Jr. and Israel overlap, I just want to make this important point about, and this goes into this. I mean, actually, interestingly, is sort of a gladio-B kind of game, but in social media or the using these platforms to, it's kind of an abstract relation, but the point is using these platforms to work their way in as if they're not, they're fighting the bad, the fighting the power, as it were, when really they're part of it. But here's Kim.com says, Dear RFK Jr., which I just don't know why these people petition the power. Like when you're clearly, it's not like he's just, oops, he made a mistake and has missed the stories. RFK Jr. knows what he's doing. He is either lying in some fantastic way in order to get him elected so he can turn around and save the world. I hope so. I don't think that's what's happening, but I certainly hope so. I really do. Or he is, for any number of other reasons, choosing to ignore the most obvious genocide that we've all seen. So why they would go, please stop doing that. It just blows my mind. It seems, anyway, it says, please change your position on Israel, he says. You don't have to fear the Israel lobby. Look, so the argument would be that he would lie because he's fearful of the lobby. Like, I wouldn't surprise me, but that's kind of, I don't know. Maybe it's just, I'll take it back. I would argue that my point would be that I'd like to believe that people who are running in that position would be willing to say the truth at all costs. But if the costs are, we'll murder your entire family, maybe there's the point is we don't really know the level these things go to. And I would argue that, there's a line clearly, but it says we have Twitter and together we can beat the Uniparty. I mean, really, I find this to be shockingly naive or willfully ignorant. We have Twitter? What? You mean the Twitter that is aggressively promoting Zionism through Net Elon? And I mean, my God, how can we be that blind? Or that's something we should consider. If you can't see that, or you're choosing to ignore it, make a note of who's doing that. It says, tell those child murdering war criminals, apartheid a-holes to go F themselves. Right. As Elon is just, a part of the agenda. And that's what we're going to talk about here. But Misty says, dude, are you joking? X is censoring anti-Israel views, and Elon Musk is working with an Israeli surveillance firm to gather our data. Also, Kennedy's a lifelong Zionist. Either they have serious dirt on him, or he's just a grade A scumbag, or both. This is silly. He says, I see a ton of Israel criticism on X, which I'm sure you would, even if they were censoring it. But it says the surveillance stuff is a typical Elon blunder. Well, that's an easy just to go, whoopsie, just a typical Elon mistake. Well, that seems like you're choosing to blind yourself to what really goes on, but maybe I'm wrong. And Kennedy is top on all other issues but Israel, which, I kind of agree with that, but kind of a big thing to be wrong on, and seems to suggest that maybe you're not as right as we think you are on other things. If you're wrong on this, that's kind of a crazy thing to say. But even then, there's, conversations to be had. If he wants to avenge his father and uncle and free America, he must change on Israel. But why would you argue if he's going to change on a dime because we ask him to? I just don't even get the logic behind this, but this is the Israel lobby owns U.S. politics, which I agree with. RFK Jr. knows that, which is interesting to say. And by the way, I have an interview set up with Corey Hughes to talk about this exact discussion, the revenge, right? The idea of Israel behind JFK conversation. We're going to talk about that, I believe, coming up next week, or maybe this week. I'm looking forward to that. Misty simply says, just because you see some of it doesn't mean a lot isn't getting censored. And typical Elon blunder is what she meant to write. You mean like hanging out with Bibi? Kennedy is not a white hat here. He's a legacy politician with nefarious ties and a willingness to support actual genocide. Take off the rose-colored glasses. Now, you can agree or disagree. I think it's hard to at least consider that she's making the best point. Now, here's why I think it's obvious that at the very least, it's not just I haven't seen it, or I'm choosing to ignore it. There's something much darker happening and from the Twitter perspective. I think it's obvious that Twitter is in a really bad way. They're clearly still censoring all over the place. But more so, it's not about the censorship today. In my mind, it's about the social engineering on overdrive in very alarming ways that I've touched on over the last months or so. But I feel like it's lost on a lot of people because I think we all kind of just assume that these things are being engineered toward what we like and so on. But it's not just about the algorithm and different tweets, guys. I think there's something much more insightful to social engineers who are, I've shown you the overlap differences to where people's entire platforms can be different and it's not just based on what you follow. There's very specific, there are things popping up that you don't follow or share, or things that are forced to pop up on your phone that you have blocked. Like there's very clear coordination happening to keep you looking at certain things at the right time, in my opinion, and again, even saying that, people are going to go, I don't even know what that means. Time will tell. I think it's a very alarming social engineering experiment that's happening right now. And in many ways, it's working. Twitter files and so on. Come on, guys. We've seen how clearly that the statements, the arguments, the promises get made, and it just drifts into the background. Well, apparently, Alex Bernanson, of all people, yeah, we can trust him on COVID, right? Come on, guys. The point is, I think that clearly they're going to keep going with the Twitter files, which has never been backed up by source material. I don't even understand how we can't see through that. But 1984 has an important point. And this kind of blew my mind. On September 11th, 2001, 14 of the 19 hijackers checked in for their flights at Boston Logan International Airport and Liberty International Airport. Now, whatever you think about the story and Saudi Arabia overlap, that's not the point. Just follow along. Although multiple hijackers were selected for additional scrutiny under what was then known as CAPS, computer-assisted passenger pre-screening system, they were all eventually allowed to board their plane and went on to fly them into the Twin Towers. Again, whatever you think about the planes, and it's about the next point that's made here, because these entities do exist, and they were in these places at that time. I think it's important. The company that was in charge of airport security and screening, and key defendant in the 9/11 tort litigation, was a company called International Consultants on Targeted Security, or ICTS. International NV, I believe. Actually, what is that? In any case, I was for International NV, a Dutch-based aviation and transportation security firm that was established in 1982 by former members of Israel's secret police, the Shin Bet. ICTS, controlling owner and chairman of the supervisory board of a man named Mechem Atzmon. Interesting last name. Menachem Atzmon, who was convicted in Israel in 1996 for campaign finance fraud while co-treasurer of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. It gets much better than that. Until his 1996 conviction, Atzmon was president of the Israel Development Fund, acronym IDF, but it's not the same, a U.S. tax-exempt foundation funneling money illegally to the Likud party of Ariel Sharon and Netanyahu, which, by the way, is not even the story. That's everywhere. Just illegal, tax-exempt funding. It's crazy. Everything. It's just amazing how much dishonesty and crime is happening that everyone ignores in regard to Israel. Now, it says, in Christopher Bolin's 2014 interview with Gilad Atzmon, Menachem's cousin, he confirmed that Menachem Atzmon was working with Shaul Eisenberg, a senior Israeli Mossad operative who tried to get the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1987, along with veteran Mossadniks Avraham Shalom Bender and Zivi Malkin as his frontmen. These guys worked closely with the infamous Israeli spy Rafi Etienne and Esser Harel, Harel, of course, was the Mossad chief who predicted in 1979 that Arabs would attack the tallest building in New York City. By the way, also Benjamin Netanyahu years later, said the same thing, specifically the World Trade Center. While 9/11 might seem like an isolated incident, remember, ICTS, the company involved in the 9/11 litigation, but also the security checkpoint that allowed the people to pass through in 9/11. While 9/11 might seem an isolated incident, ICTS also handled security, interestingly enough, at the Charles de Gaulle Airport outside Paris when the shoe bomber boarded a U.S. plane in 2001, which added to the whole conversation, the TSA, the whole screening game they play, was also working security at the London bus network during the July 7, 2005 suicide bomb attacks. A lot of these notorious, infamous events. Also, the Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport at December 25th, 2009, when suicide bomber Umar Farooq managed to pass through security despite apparently only having a one-way ticket, no luggage, no passport. Good thing they had that security there. And the Brussels airport, the scene of a bomb attack on March 22nd, 2016. Now, here's the most important part. 1 year after 9/11, in 2002, ICTS launched a technology division and expanded into digital verification. They formed a subsidiary company, that was founded by a relative of ICTS owner, Menachem Atzman, and former member of Israeli Shin Bet Unit 8200, Ron Atzman. They named the company Authentics, which I've been calling Autotics. Think about how wild that is. I mean, is there no end to this is absolutely ridiculous. We're talking about the company, in case you don't know, that Twitter is currently using to siphon your personal data, or otherwise known as your verification process. What was it? I think it's this one. So they're using this company, Authentics, as I guess it's pronounced. Oh, that's not the right one. Let's see. I think I have it over here, actually. On one of these. Hold on, I just want to grab. I mean, actually, it's not that. It's not important because I posted underneath one of these. But the point is that they've gone much further than I did in that show. So the point, I did a show about this recently. I guess we covered it on this one as well that I just closed. But the point is Twitter is using Authentics to verify your identity, and on their own documentation shows that they take your biometrics when they do so, even though that's not what Twitter's even asking for yet. And this is a Israeli company tied to Unit 8200, working in the interest of Israel, who was literally infamously connected to some of the largest attacks that you could argue, 9/11 in particular, allowing them to board the plane that were clearly, without question, connected to Israel. This should make us all very uncomfortable. Menachem, is that how it's pronounced? Now here is what Censored Man is highlighting. He says, read this thread before verifying your ID on X, Twitter. He tags Elon Musk, recently announced that everyone must verify their identity on X in order to be monetized. This involves handing over our government-issued IDs and biometric data to a verification company. That company is Authentics. In this thread, we'll go over Authentics' dark history, connection to Israeli intelligence, and much more. Huge shout out to the official 1984 account we just read from for helping with a lot of the research. So here is the video they highlight. We'll play this first.
David, what do you know about Elon Musk's partners for verification at X, this Authentics outfit?
Well, it's a company which will identify the blue ticks. You know, when you pay X or Twitter as it was called for blue ticks, and now they're going to have this identity authentication system, which is run by this Israeli company, which the parent of which was set up, as we saw there, by Israeli intelligence officers from the Shin Bet, which is the internal intelligence agency of Israel. So you've got, and of course they will be gathering data on this. And this is not the first time we've reported this kind of thing on this show. We've reported this time and time again. Companies which are engaged in in the tech industry and can get access to ordinary people's data through the police or through the military or through the intelligence services. And in this case, they're able to do that. The data will be submitted, passports, selfies, and the access to this for the Israeli intelligence services will be there, presumably. One presumes that that's what it's for from their point of view. And of course, this is not something which is going to help most ordinary users of Twitter. In fact, it's going to be a deliberate and definite harm to ordinary users if it is used and or abused by Israel, which of course it's very likely that it will be.
Content creators using X's premium subscriptions are becoming concerned that their ID information may fall into the hands of Israel's intelligence agency, Shin Bet. But why? Let me explain. In late 2023, X announced it would be enlisting an Israel-based ID verification and risk management company called Authentics to aid it with ID verification for its premium users, with the users' personal information set to be stored on the Israeli firm servers for up to 30 days, meaning users now have to upload not only a biometric photo, but also their IDs by July 1, or they will not receive payouts. Now, ID verification is standard practice to prevent fraudulent activities and identity theft online. All this was fine until users began digging and investigated the third-party company hired by X. Authentics, which serves major clients such as Uber, Google, LinkedIn, and PayPal, was founded in 2002 by Ron Atzman, who previously served in Israel's notorious Unit 8200, the Army's largest intelligence division. Now, according to Yair Cohen, the former head of Unit 8200, the company provides 90% of Israel's intelligence material and is employing the same facial recognition technology in its collaboration with X that Unit 8200 uses to monitor, target, and collect intelligence on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. 2002 by Ron notorious Unit 8200, the Army's largest intelligence division. Now, according to Yair Cohen, the former head of Unit 8200, the company provides 90% of Israel's intelligence material.
I just don't want you to miss that. I mean, am I misunderstanding what he's saying right here? He's not talking about Unit 8200, guys. He's saying the founder of Authentics, with a staff number of 10,000, this unit is Israel's main intelligence, 90% of its intelligence material. Israel's government gains 90% of its intelligence material from the company, from the Authentics app platform that Twitter is using to take your personal information. I mean, and we're talking about the same government that is actively, aggressively showing itself to be not just dishonest, but criminal, to the point to where they will lie about everything.
Let me preface these remarks with I never, ever believe Israeli figures. I've been in the government too long to know that the Israelis are patent liars.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Let's trust that they won't do something with your data. And this is the point that Censored Man made. What happens if you're a Palestinian on Twitter? Is that going to affect your ability? Yes. My opinion, but 100% yes, guys. How are we not going to consider that, how that obvious reality is taking place? That blows my mind. That there are people that choose not to see that, or because Israel, ally, we just pretend it doesn't matter. But frankly, I think that is a rapidly diminishing number on the left and the right. My opinion.
Material and is employing the same facial recognition technology in its collaboration with X that Unit 8200 uses to monitor, target, and collect intelligence on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories.
As well as using the same thing to surveil Palestinians. But as Purple Nurple points out in the chat, right? But don't worry, though, the FBI was removed from Twitter a long time ago, right? But we replaced it, or probably didn't. They just left it there, but also brought on Israel's FBI and intelligence and surveillance. I mean, it's so crazy to me that people can't acknowledge how obvious this is. But I think a lot of people are calling it out. Now, guys, it goes without saying. I will not do this. You should not do this, no matter what. I think this is a dangerous step. Now, I don't know why it's being selectively applied. As far as I'm concerned, the only thing I've ever added to them was the things I used to sign up the 10 plus years ago on Twitter. I've never had to add anything else, not even with this blue tick, which I pointed out at the time. I simply had to confirm my information, and it happened. I'm sure that's going to change. I don't know why that is. It's interesting to me. But if something is asked that has to do with biometrics or anything other than what's currently on file, I'm going to say no. So it may come to the point where we're pushed off this platform. But I recommend you do the same because something very dark is happening here.
Adding to that, it deals with a huge volume of sensitive data due to the nature and profiles of its clientele, although how it uses this data remains opaque. So, are ex-premium users right to be worried about how their personal information will be preserved and processed by a third-party company like Authentics, given the very close ties it has to the Israeli government and past scandals involving Israeli tech companies?
Wow. Absolutely crazy, guys. So going forward, he says the founder of Authentics, Ron Otzman, is related to the owner of ICTS. You know, the seemingly notorious security verification group that was allowing people to go onto planes that later became terrorists pretty consistently, right? And when you can very clearly highlight that there is an Israel overlap to 9/11 and the rest of these terrorist attacks, both are former Israeli intelligence Shin Bet Unit 8200. Of course they are. This is the 2014 transcript from the Chris Bolin interview with Gilad Otzman, the cousin of Menachem. Is that what it was again? Somebody put it in the chat. It was Menachem. Menachem? Really? Menachem. Oh, yeah, I guess so. Menachem Otzman. So it says, during the interview, Gilad confirms Menachem's ties to Mossad and Shaul Eisenberg, which we highlighted before, but just, you know, there's depth to this. You can read this for yourself. As always, we're giving you things to continue to follow up on. I think it's safe to say, he says, that ICTS is not a security company. It's more like a Mossad-operated false flag terrorism company. That's his opinion, but I think it's hard not to see the outlines of that. And it says, are these really the kind of people you want to be in business with, Elon Musk? Like, why? That could just be to make his tag him so it gets, you know, but the point is, it's not like he woke up one day and was like, oh no, I didn't know it was happening. These are conscious choices being made. He's a government contractor, guys. He's tied in with everything that's happening. Better yet, it says, this is kind of the people you trust our data and facial biometrics with. Apparently so. Now, I'll leave it there just for time in general, but I'll include, I did find this, just looking for it real quick. This was the one we did on December 22nd. Israel Unit 8200 tied company runs Twitter verification. Way, way, way ahead of this conversation being had now. Just always demonstrating our value. If you watch this platform, follow our articles, our shows, we tend to be ahead of these stories. And this, I guess I followed up on May 31st, highlighting Authentics again. I think this was the time we just discussed based on Censored Man's amazing research. And this is the same. Maybe I'll read some of these points. Let me see. I forget. These were pretty redundant. Like they're both working at the same research, right? You can see the same kind of images and so on. But looks, you know, I mean, it's basically the same. He's simply saying this same video we just played. Yeah, I'll leave it there. You can read this if you want, you know, more in depth. The bottom line to me, I think, is a wild that we're talking about a company that Israel's intelligence gets 90% of its intelligence from is now being used to secure your data. I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous. Now, on top of that, as you were mentioning in the chat just now, guys, this is also the point about the bots, which is just absurd. Right? Censored Man also highlights, before using this, read this thread. After reading it, you will understand why so many of us are opposing Elon's decision to make us hand over our IDs and biometric data to Israeli intelligence. And he simply highlights the other side of this. So it turns out Elon's trip to Israel wasn't just for kosher theater and IDF propaganda tour. A secret meeting that took place while he was there that went virtually unreported. In attendance was Netanyahu, in all sorts of intelligence and government overlaps. And the point was, the solution Musk was presented with to stop the bad guy bots, an Israeli company called CHEQ, a company founded by, guess what, ex-Israeli intelligence Unit 8200 CEO Guy, however you pronounce that, Tai Tudovic, that combats bots and fake users, of course, except that's not even remotely what's actually happening. It's gotten shockingly worse since the moment this started. And I'm sure we're all surprised by that, right? This is just from yesterday. Yesterday, maybe a little bit more. I just want to highlight this is 3 pictures of this same thing. And most of these, that's not even real. Hello, my sister saw your profile seems to be a kind of a really common bot thing, but it goes on. Bot, all of them, every one of them. All these are 3 different pages of bots over the past 24 hours. There's something going on there, guys. I think it's about bombing them with, so I think they can, sort of like they used to say, if you have comments in your chat that they didn't like, they can blame you and hold you accountable for it. I think there's something to that. We'll find out, I guess. But we are getting bombarded with these bots since that happened. Can anybody guess why? I don't know for sure, but I tend to think it has to do with what we're talking about. And then on that same back point about, please change your position on Israel, Kim.com asked RFK Jr., Sam Husseini simply highlights it's possible that the whole point of RFK Jr. is to keep the uniparty in place while pretending to rail against it. He's effectively SHIT coding a lot of legit criticism since he's obviously twisted. Now, you can argue it's by accident, but I agree with him. I think that he is changing the way people perceive certain criticisms because of his terrible stance. Maybe that's the whole point. Just question everything, guys. Now, let's get into some of the horrible things we're talking about here that overlap with why I think it's not a surprise, not shocking at all, that Israel's government is behind a lot of the stuff we're talking about. Caitlin Johnstone simply said, to start this off, keep opposing, and this is not just Israel, right? The U.S. is, if not an equal, maybe more responsible for what we're currently seeing because of their ability to stop it. Keep opposing U.S. warmongering for the rest of your life. Don't let Gaza be a one-off, guys. The U.S. and its allies always do evil, murderous things like this, and they always lie about it. And the media always helps them lie about it. This is not new. It's just the first time in years that a large number of Westerners have been fiercely critical of the foreign policy of the U.S. centralized empire because it's more obvious than the empire's other crimes. She says this SHIT has been happening continuously and will continue to happen after the butchery in Gaza is done. Sadly, I agree. You just need to pay very close attention to the U.S. war machine and the critical voices who monitor its crimes. To her point, if you missed it, it's nothing new here, guys. Just take advantage of the moment we have. We have an opening here to make some change happen because people are seeing not just the one thing, but the bigger picture, even just a sliver of it. And as usual, you get the two-party paradigm desperate to keep the status quo that jump in and go, no, don't look at all of that. That's all just George Soros. No, don't look it over there. It's all just the game they play to hide the bigger picture. It's left and the right. It's happening on both sides, right? And it's you can't stop seeing it if you actually see it. It's like watching corporate media and then one day recognizing how cartoonish they are. You just can't go back. You turn it on and you go, God, how did I ever watch these idiots? How transparently dishonest they are. That's what they're desperate to keep you locked into. Now, interesting point about October 7th. I just had a great interview with Ricky Varandas, by the way. I don't know if that comes out today or not, but we talked about some of this. But Anti-War did their own article on this. I just want to highlight this because they do amazing work. IDF report found multiple cases of friendly fire deaths on October 7th. I think theirs was like 14, but the bottom line, it's way more than that. This is their release valve, in my opinion, just letting out the small part of the bigger picture because they're already caught. The point is, we already knew this. October 7th, Hannibal Directive, foreknowledge, it's important. Ben Swan put out his own statement on this. This is a small little clip, but he simply says, what have Netanyahu and his own government said on the record about 10/7? They've admitted that the attack on 10/7 gave them their support they needed, domestically and abroad, to obliterate Hamas, which now they're admitting can't happen. But he says Netanyahu's government knew it was happening, and they let it happen. And there's really just no way around that. I don't know everybody. I can't speak to who and what parts, but I know it's clear that at some level, unless all of this is a coordinated leak, which is certainly possible too, but I don't think so, they knew and allowed this to some degree. And I covered this in depth on the 18th. The undeniable reality of October 7th foreknowledge and the Hannibal Directive. Make sure you watch that. I think it's important. Now, here is what Censored Man highlights. Mehdi Hassan, who's interviewing Dean Phillips, Congressman Dean Phillips, on Israel's murder of hundreds of Palestinian civilians in order to retrieve 4 hostages. Now, this is just on the al-Nusra bombing and using humanitarian aid trucks to raid the area. Remember, they bombed the market to distract everybody, which they just conflate and act like there was all human shields, except they weren't even going into the market. They went into buildings and they just killed everyone in front of themselves there and killed 3 hostages to save the 4. If that's even what ultimately was what their plan was, I don't know. But here Phillips struggles to try to rationalize this. And you're going to get a very, I did this last time too, Madeleine Albright feeling here. 500,000 children. Yeah, we think it's worth it.
We saw 4 Israeli hostages rescued from inside of Gaza by an Israeli military and police operation, returned to their families. A very good thing. Mm-hmm. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, all reacted with praise, with celebration. None of them, in their initial responses, had a single word to say about the over 200 Palestinians reportedly killed, over 700 injured in that rescue operation, many of them innocent women and children. A lot of people have been asking this for the last 8-9 months. I'm sure you hear it in your constituency. Do Palestinian lives just not matter to the modern Democratic Party?
Oh, I think that's a horrifying statement. Let me acknowledge let me acknowledge the 38,000.
It's strange that he would make it only about the Democratic Party, because very clearly you have a much stronger sentiment to ignore this on the right. But equally, I would argue, general disregard from the higher levels of the government, both sides of it, with the occasional, Jill Stein kind of outlier, which you can decide for yourself if it's honest. But either way, my point, I think, is that I don't trust Mehdi Hasan. I really don't, because of how, he was sitting there calling you a murderer for not taking the vaccine. It was a little bit intense and how crazy obvious that was. So I just find this hard to wrap my mind around. But whatever his reasoning, I think what he's saying here is correct.
Human beings killed in Gaza, the 1,200 Israelis, but particularly the innocents. To me, it's all the same. They're human beings. I'm appalled and disgusted. First of all, there are Americans being held hostage. Let me change the lens for a moment.
There's Americans in Gaza, too. There's over 600 of them that have been there since October 7th forward, but they don't ever talk about that.
I believe, if anything, it has been the United States and the Biden administration should have been the foremost responsibility to extract our hostages, our nationals. I think there are 6 or 7 still. We don't know even if they're alive. So the question is,
again, so you make a point to extract the people that are, what about the Gaza civilians who are there that don't want to be there? There's even people, and again, this is not to suggest that Americans are any more important than anybody else, but from a government perspective, they're the ones they should be caring about more. And the point is, there were people that were Palestinian Americans that were there, but there were also just Americans that had family there that were just American citizens that were there. There was one woman that had a pretty prominent story. I think she died in a hospital. They don't care. They just don't even talk about it. Not them, not anybody. I find that really shocking.
Would we undertake an effort to extract American hostages 2, 3, 4, 7 if we knew 200 civilians would be killed in the process?
What's the answer?
Boy, that's a tough. That's a tough question. That's a tough question.
That really does blow my mind. This is the moving of at least the way they perceive the Overton window. There's no way that's a hard question. Killing 200 innocent people to save 4 people, and we're not talking about we're talking about civilians. I can't, this is unreal that he's trying to frame this as a difficult situation. I think they've lost the plot here. I mean, not that they haven't always been this maniacal, but they think we are somehow coming along with this. I don't think that's the case.
You're the leader of a country? Absolutely.
You killed 200 people to save 6.
Mehdi, look at first of all, I'm the son of I'm a Gold Star son. I lost my dad in Vietnam. One of the most despicable, I think, wars of the United States has ever prosecuted. We've killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people over the years. We continue to.
Okay, so I don't even know why this is like Lindsey Graham saying, well, we used nukes back then. Why is it okay now? It was wrong then, too.
What we did in Japan to end a war.
Yep,
these are
it was wrong there, too.
Philosophical questions that most Americans would never want to be faced with.
But you're a member of Congress, right?
I'm a member of Congress.
You wanted to be president.
Yes.
So let me ask you the straight-up question.
Let me answer your question.
Please.
I believe, as the President of the United States, his or her obligation should always be the safety and security of Americans first. It does not mean dismissing other humanity. But in the case of hostages, when it comes to this, and we've tried this before, and we've seen carnage. The fact of the matter is, I think we should extract. And by the way, if that means there are civilian deaths as a result, unfortunately, that's, I think, a cost.
But see, this is what I have such a hard time with. A cost to who? Why is it their responsibility to be that cost? He's not even necessarily saying human shields. Just saying that we're just, in the process, they just die. That's the assumption you're supposed to put in your mind, but they didn't say that. Either way, even if you were talking about 200 people held, they're simply justifying what Israel's doing. That's all that really is about right there. Or he is, at the very least. Saying that you're somehow, it's okay because you care about those lives more than the others. Now, you may think that's right for a government to do that. I don't. Life is human life, period. The idea, though, that if you were saying, 200 Hamas members, other military members, to save those 4 in the battle with them, well, most people would be like, well, that's military. But even then, it's a stretch. But when you're talking about innocent civilian lives, you are rationalizing something very dangerous right there. And I think far too many people, I don't think a majority, but far too many are now leaning into the whole might is right mentality.
cost implies there's no other choice. We, of course, know that there was another way to get the hostages out.
I have empathy.
No, well, hold on. There's another way to get the hostages out. We got over 100 hostages out in a deal in November. You could have got Benjamin Netanyahu blocking another deal. But just I want to be very specific. In your view, is killing 274 Palestinians, including many children, an acceptable price to pay for the freeing of 4 Israelis?
Like I said, I don't. This you want a clear answer, and you want to make this black and white.
Is it an acceptable price to pay?
It's an unacceptable price, but I think it's a price that has to be paid.
Wow.
So, if you're saying that to get free people from the clutches of horrible captivity, hostages, people possibly being abused in captivity, to free them, you have to pay a price, right? It's a horrible price. Does that ratio work the other way? How many Israelis can Palestinians kill in order to free Palestinian detainees who are currently being tortured in Israeli captivity, some of them being raped to death, according to the New York Times last week? Can they kill 200 Israelis? Hold on, let me finish the question. Can they kill 200 Israelis to free 4 Palestinians who are being tortured in an Israeli prison?
I think it's a question that I'm sure Palestinians are asking the same way as Israelis.
But no, you answered it. You answered it for Israel. I would like you to answer it in reverse.
Let me just clarify something you just said. You said Palestinian prisoners are being raped to death by Israeli soldiers?
Yes, this is a report in the New York Times last week.
See, he isn't. I mean, he could be lying, but he's like, to him, that's Chinese. I haven't heard about that. How is that possible? It's a New York Times article. Doesn't mean it's true. I believe that it is. But do you believe he just hasn't ever heard of that? I don't buy it. But that's a very telling statement.
Okay, I don't believe that to be true. Nonetheless,
of course, because it just can't be, because that's not what I'm supposed to say. Despite the fact that it was a UN-backed, human rights group-backed, in corporate media article, to him, that's supposed to mean everything. But nope, not when you're talking about Israel, though. I like their narrative. We'll go with that.
A 41-year-old detainee said, the interrogators made me sit on something like a hot metal stick, and it felt like fire. He said another detainee died after they put the electric stick up his anus.
No, it's repulsive.
This is an Israeli dungeon that CNN and New York Times have both reported on. UN investigators. So to free people from that prison, can you kill lots of innocent people according to the logic of the raid in Gaza?
What I'm trying to say is, if you represent the Palestinian people, you represent the Israeli people, we look at this quite differently.
I know you do, which is why I'm asking the question, Congressman. I understand that you see it differently. A lot of people watching at home say, why? Why aren't all lives equal?
They should be.
But they're not.
Yep. I mean, that's crazy. That's really crazy to me. It should be. And this is the same thing.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Pretty simple. Ask yourself how in the world that was not challenged. All they did was normalize the idea. The good guy can do what they want, even though it's not even the reality. Now here is a current member of the Israeli government saying, quote, I am personally proud of the ruins of Gaza, and that every baby, even 80 years from now, will tell their grandchildren what the Jews did. Yeah, she's probably right, just not in the way she thinks. This is what she's saying. The Minister of Social Equality in Israel. Let that sink in. They're not only proud of what they're currently doing, the Zionist Israeli government, they are promoting this as what we will tell our children for decades and centuries to come. The Minister of Social Equality. You just can't miss what's going on. They're either mixed up in some of the most aggressive social engineering, willful, like cult mentality, or they are some evil people. Possibly both. Here was what Abir will show you. The destruction of Rafah. And she says, so Hamas lived in all those houses, right? Incredibly surgical too, right? Extermination is the word, she says. This is Rafah. This is what it looks like now. This is why it's so obvious to experts, okay? People that actually care, not blinded by politics, but people that are truly researching this from, international human rights levels, showing you there's no way to misunderstand what that shows you. Look at how dense that is. Look at what they turned it into. Do you see tunnels? Their claim is there's tunnel under every house. Well, at some point, we're going to be able to prove that's not true because it's not true. No matter what you look at from before, they are exterminating the area. Cuts News Network highlights, as many of other research and investigative research and even studies have shown. The UN Mine Action Service has estimated significant contamination of explosive ordnance in the besieged Gaza Strip, even more than in Ukraine. Clearing this ordnance would require a, quote, very significant amount of time and hundreds of millions of dollars, which will never happen if the Palestinians are still there. The UN Environment Program estimates that currently there are 37 million tons of rubble in Gaza, which is more than Ukraine, comparing the front lines of both places to highlight the heavy destruction and how much they fixate on whatever happens in Ukraine, but will ignore this as Israel defending itself. The Ukrainian front line is 600 miles long, while Gaza's front line is 25 miles. The point there is showing you the unbelievably over the amount of, respectively, the amount of destruction, comparatively rather, 25 miles long versus 600 miles long, and they are 37, what is it? Sorry, the wrong number. Shockingly more in Gaza. 13,000 tons of explosives here. In Ukraine, 79,000 explosive tons in Gaza. 25 miles in Gaza for the front line, 600 in Ukraine. 36 square miles in Gaza, 905 square miles in Ukraine. There's, but best moral army in the world, taking more precautions than anyone ever in history. Just lies, just blatant lies, completely backed up by your illegitimate governments, wherever they may be. Here is Netanyahu making sure you know, despite all of the screaming that we just went through, no permanent ceasefire plan, says Middle East Eye, but this is definitely what is being reported. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has said he's open to a partial deal, and this is reported, pretty much every platform, corporate media, and so on. Partial deal. There's really no confusing this, guys. A partial deal is not the same as what was being pushed. So the end point here is that the entire conversation about Hamas not accepting the deal. What was the deal? A permanent ceasefire, according to the United States. But the only thing was different was they wanted a three-phase plan of it. So by the end of the third phase, there would be a permanent ceasefire. But they never, even when you listen to them speak when that was happening, they say, well, no, we have to destroy Hamas first. And that's why we all laughed at how dumb it was. But they kept pushing it. Blinken went on his tour and said, it's only Hamas. They're the only one. And here he comes now at the end of all of that and going, well, no, we don't want permanent. We have to defeat Hamas. And that's why people with a brain were going, explain for me how you can have a ceasefire with a group they want to destroy before the ceasefire takes effect. They've been playing everybody that wants to play. And at the end of the day, they're killing children while that's happening. They're starving people while that's happening. And he's just coming out and saying he strongly condemns, or the family strongly condemn him and accuse him of walking back his previous proposal because he did. It's really mind-blowing. And this is the point about the people on the ground. Protests in Tel Aviv against Netanyahu's coalition was the largest since the Gaza war began, with tens of thousands of Israelis demanding a ceasefire deal and the return of the captives. Also, the removal of the extreme government.
Right now, what is most urgent to us is to bring back the hostages and end the war. And change the government, which is why we went to the streets a year and a half ago. And this is the only way we can reach the other targets, because with this government, nothing will change.
A year and a half ago, right? That was because it was about the judicial reforms and much more, by the way. We covered it then. The point was they were unhappy with Netanyahu and the government. They wanted him arrested. The guy has moments for going to jail, and then October 7th. Now, that's not to say that it was all because of that, but I guarantee it played on the foreknowledge conversation. But they're calling them all out. Not just Netanyahu, but Ben Gvir, Smotrich, the extreme side of the government that are leading them into chaos. How is this not part of the conversation as we're all being called racist for pointing the same thing out? They're lost. They have lost control.
Only way to reach a change here is to kick this government out and to kick the extreme people and to make sure that we stop killing each other. It's time to end the war, to bring back the hostages, and to save lives in the Israeli side and also in the Palestinian side.
Not what we usually hear from the corporate conversation, is it? Now recognize, guys, I genuinely do not think that there is a not extreme part of this current government. There's different levels of extreme, but it's very clear to see that the vast majority of them are okay with what's happening there. So even if you get rid of the religion, the Jewish Power Party and the Religious Zionism Party, which is the kind of most extreme, I would argue, they're still completely okay with genocide in Gaza. That's my opinion. So I think it's dangerous. Either way, it shows you a changing of the mood of even the Israelis on the ground. Now, and my Plaid points out, please let this be the first clear statement of the end of the ethnocide in Gaza. This is Netanyahu shutting down, reestablishing Gaza settlements as not realistic. Now, personally, I don't buy it. I think this is him losing and trying to release some steam. Right? Seeing that they know, I mean, this is the main point is they're already doing this. They're already building things. They're already having conferences and selling land in other parts of the world in Gaza. It's not something you really pull back at this point. But the point is, I think he wants everyone watching to think, nah, that's probably not going to happen, but secretly keep doing it. That's what I believe this is. But it shows you that they are losing control and lost control. And now they're starting to realize that. Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur, highlights the genocide in Gaza is happening. Now, I couldn't figure out what this was. I looked this up for a while. She says genocide in Gaza is happening because PAGs from Gaza. Tell me in the chat if you know what that is. Probably something simple that I could just overthinking it. But because PAGs from Gaza gave Israel the opportunity to unleash the perfect storm after months and years of testing violent repression, annihilation techniques against Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. She says her friend once described this person here once described this as pedagogical violence. Interesting. Violence practiced on the Palestinians so that they, quote, learn the lesson and go back to their place of subjugating ones. The depravity Israel has reached these past 9 months is matched only by the depravity of those who are arming, aiding, abetting, and even profiting from its genocide of the Palestinians. Just like all the rest of them. Sadly, it seems like the information comes out and nothing happens, but we can see who profited from the Rwanda genocide. Israel chief among them, or Bosnia, same point. It says, we, the peoples, we, the global human rights community, will not let this go away unpunished. Now here, she highlights what Peace Now was showing you that Smotrich said. He said out loud what Netanyahu's trying to hide. Bottom line, and I'll read you the actual statements, it says that he's revealed by Settlement Watch team where he openly admits that they are carrying out annexation behind the scenes, which we already know is happening, and that Netanyahu fully supports him. He says the truth is that at first we thought of transferring it from the Ministry of Defense. In the end, this is the result of two considerations. First, it would be easier to swallow in the political and legal context, so that they wouldn't say that we are now declaring annexation and sovereignty, because that's what they're doing. It's all manipulation. It's all surreptitious. It says, so we did not change the legal status of the land, which is what they wanted. The military commander is still the sovereign. But we created a separate civilian system. It says there is a ministry within the Ministry of Defense. There's a minister. There is an administration. It says, which is like a government ministry. The head of the administration is equivalent to the CEO of a government ministry. It says there is a deputy head of the civil administration who is civilian, an employee of the Ministry of Defense. It says subordinate not to the head of the civil administration, not to the commander of the central command, but directly to the settlement administration. So all the people screaming they're not settler colonial, they call themselves settlers, guys. All of the authorities of the head of the civil administration were delegated to him. And says, the thing that allowed me to persuade the prime minister, see, meaning that he's on board. And I will also say a good word to you about the prime minister. For to praise him, I must say that from the moment he understood the event, he is completely with us, he says. Now, of course, he could be lying, but I don't think so. All these matters are irrelevant to the question of whether there is another minister in the Ministry of Defense. The administration is permanent. The division will solidify it. It will be under the Ministry of Defense. The transfer of the legal responsibilities is permanent. Even if the government falls tomorrow and I leave, that's it. So they've literally created some kind of like shadow government element to justify controlling this area, even if the government collapses. That's how crazy and belligerent these people are about ethnically cleansing Gaza. So as he comes out, Netanyahu, and goes, never mind, maybe that's not realistic. I don't buy it because they're already doing it, guys. That's the main point of this. They're already doing this. And we're going to talk about the synagogue discussion in I think, I'll get to in a second, whatever this location that was in the United States. But we've already covered this. They are quite literally selling Gaza territory in auctions around the country. In the United States, I saw one in the UK. It's mind-blowing in how obviously criminal this is, according to every legal standard anywhere. So that's what they're doing. Here, Propaganda & Co. highlights the story we're going to get into. He says, Zionist Jews are gaslighting all over Twitter about pogroms in Los Angeles. That's where it was. They are the biggest liars in the world. The protesters were disrupting an event at a synagogue that was selling settlements in Palestine. Simple. Selling stolen land. According to international law and even the United States, for crying out loud. It says violent Zionist thugs like the ones who attacked the UCLA encampment then started attacking protesters. Guys, there's video everywhere about it. But it didn't matter. LAPD just watched it and even arrested Palestinian supporters being beat up. So this guy with the ponytail and the mask on, which of course, if got a mask on, all the right's going to ignore everything that's happening and blame George Soros or whatever else, which there are elements of this to consider. I'm tired of the two-party illusion ignoring easy things to cover. Well, so they just started attacking him. This is just one example. And he's talking to the police. Like, are you going to do something? Look at that. They don't even move. You hear him? I mean, you couldn't hear it's low, but he said, are you going to do something or what? This guy's literally screaming in his face. Right? Look at this. They're trying to punch him while he's standing next to the police. They don't even care. Look at them laughing about it. Now, look, now they're hassling this woman who was just standing there. I mean, this is just one example, guys. It's all over the place, and it's very easy to see. Look at that. Called her a bitch. Clearly, it's, I mean, the game is that it's all their fault. The way they frame this is they attack the synagogue because they hate Jews. That's the same game that gets played every time. Now, the point was the synagogue was hosting an event selling stolen land, and the land in illegal settlements was in Palestine. They are pro-genocide, pro-ethnic cleansing, and you expect sympathy, he says. But this is publicly posted, guys. And here is the pretend human rights lawyer who doesn't know anything apparently about human rights, at least when it comes to Palestinians, who says, no, this is not Gaza or Germany, 1930s, because they're so similar, right? It's just such a lazy overlap. It says, this is Los Angeles. A pro-Hamas mob attacks Jews outside a synagogue while the LAPD looks the other way. That's what he frames this as. And of course, all you catch is a clip where action's going on and don't show where this starts, which is shockingly easy to see. I mean, this video just is chaos. That's the whole point. You just got people fighting. No context, just because what he lays over it. They know this is there. My point always is people like Oren, or whatever it is. That's the other guy. Oren's the other guy. This one is Arsen Otrovsky. They know they're lying to you guys. This pretend international human rights lawyer knows he's misrepresenting this. Easy to see. Don't you crash on me, Twitter. Come on. There it goes. So Film the Police LA just simply says gaslighting. Because this councilwoman, Katie, who just relays what she's told, says these anti-Semitic violence that broke out today. And, well, first of all, we're talking about illegal land being sold by the state of Israel. Why that becomes anti-Semitic is only because you guys just say anything against Israel means you hate Jews, which is not the case. But that's just whatever. Lie for your own agenda. But it says, would have been completely unacceptable anywhere in Los Angeles, but this was a plan and carried out in front of a synagogue. So she's just relaying the narrative that's not true. And here's yet another video showing you the same thing. This is the same guy, again, being accosted. See that? They're throwing things at him. They're kicking him. And see, that was with that precursor. So the point is, you see him just standing here. They're all attacking him, and they're kicking him, and he tries to go to the cops, and they do it right in front of the police. Look at that. That guy punching him in the face. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Now here, it goes start march down the street. And this is what the precursor was to what the arson was trying to lie to you about. Look at him. They're just pushing, kicking people, trying to start problems. Nobody was doing it. That's them doing that to random people walking down the street. This is one of these guys right here. Actually, you see him in a couple of them who's just being wildly aggressive. Just because they support Palestine. That's it. It's a constant. This guy's one of them too. Running around. Look at him. Running around, attacking anybody. And they know they're protected here. They know no one's doing anything about it. All right. So now you see the fight break out. And in this case, it looks like the police actually walk up, but they don't do anything about it. They just stand there. And you know what happens in reverse. Here's another video. This one, I actually can't believe this. This one is one of the most ridiculous examples. So you have a car with a family in it driving into the gas station. Now, whatever you think is being said, the point is she could very well be screaming things that are insulting. Regardless, they're in a car driving into the gas station, right? Into an open, they're blocking the entrance to the gas station. Now, Gaza Notification says during the demonstration in Los Angeles, a pro-genocide group harassed an anti-war family in the vehicle. Instead of removing the crowd harassing the family, the LAPD detained at, I think it was a gunpoint. I only watched it once. The parents and the baby in the vehicle. And there's the video you saw a second ago. Check this out. Right. So there she is, flipping them off. Right. There's that free expression. Okay, so at this point, regardless of her saying things to them, whatever else, they're trying to drive in the gas station. Okay, watch the way the police respond to this. Yeah, they have tasers and I think a gun pull, and it might be a taser, some kind of a taser or something, but they have weapons drawn, guys. How in the world do you explain that? I mean, look, they even have some people taunting them while they're doing this to them. And their cops are like, get out of the way. Why is that? This blows my mind. Wow. Look at this. You get the point. I mean, that seriously blows my mind. They get the baby out of the car. They're sitting there aiming their guns at it. Now, how do we not see this as a slanted way to deal with this? How much you want to bet that baby ends up in some CPS room? My God. Remy Kanazi says, 1, Zionists host a Palestinian land theft event in a synagogue. 2, Zionists claim anti-land theft protesters are anti-Semitic. 3, Zionists attack the protesters, mace them, get the cops on them. 4, politicians then condemn anti-Semitism and reaffirm in misinformation. Over and over and over. Same video here, but this is the point. Totally insane. Yesterday, the LA crowds of fascist Zionists committed several felonies on video, violently attacking dozens of people, including reporters, by the way. Cops stood by and watched and even arrested Palestinian protesters being attacked. Now the president and the mayor side with the fascists, he says. President Biden, I'm appalled by the scenes outside of the synagogue. Of course you are, Biden, because you're a Zionist. Self-proclaimed. It's just shocking how dishonest this is. On the surface. Sort of like all of the protests we saw where they were being attacked and everybody everywhere lied about it until the facts came out showing they were lying. Over and over. And then, of course, the story didn't change. All the people reporting all the fake news didn't care to adjust the story. Of course not. Here's one that I had pulled aside from earlier, which is an important clip, actually. Since we're talking about this, I'll grab this real quick. It's the one that I referenced. This is the kind of stuff we've been talking about. Stefanik, who is just a clearly, whatever reason, just blindly pushing this anti-Semitism concept for her own benefit, I can guarantee it. Here's what she has to say about this. We talked about this at one of these past shows, but she's really aggressively pushing this narrative about chanting through the school. The Jews are bad, whatever it was. I can kill all the Jews. She was screaming they were chanting, right? Well, the person she invites here, the cop, says that didn't happen. I investigated it. It didn't happen. Guess what she never stopped talking about? That lie. She's brought this up since then.
I want to switch to Origins High School. In October, 40 to 50 students marched through Origins High School.
Never happened.
Chanting death to Israel and
never happened.
Kill the Jews.
Never happened.
In addition, an independent investigation found that a teacher who teaches global history was told by a student, quote, "I wish you were killed." Another student called her, quote, "a dirty Jew." And the student said he wished Hitler could have hit more Jews, including her.
Never happened. How great that is to just relay fake information you got for some Zionist like the point is somebody in her ear said, this is what happened. And she blindly went along with it because self-interest.
What disciplinary actions have been taken against those students who chanted death to Israel at Origins High School and against the student who harassed with anti-Semitic slurs that teacher?
Two things. First of all, when we have done our investigation, we have found no evidence that there was any movement through the hall saying death to the Jews. We looked at, and I treat that very, very seriously. That was reported in the papers. We have found no evidence that that actually happened.
Oh, cool. So she just blindly regurgitates whatever works for their narrative. Who cares about the facts? And guess what? Went on to keep saying it. Because narrative is more important. That's who we're talking about. Now, all of that's to say, right, that we're talking about a very clear agenda that is not slowing down. As they're still killing people, as they're redirecting outrage to something that never happened, or misrepresenting what actually happened in this recent attack in LA. By Zionists against people there that were protesting. The point is, all of this is on the idea that we're fighting some most moral war against bad guy Hamas. But guess what? Their own people are now admitting that Hamas cannot be destroyed. So there is no ability for them to do the one thing they say they need to do for this to end. So either this is a guaranteed way to make this new war on terror never stop, or they just want to completely destroy everything with Palestine and claim that that is what they were doing. That's all Hamas, which is kind of what they're saying. Amidar points out, for the last 8 months, many of us have been vilified for saying Hamas can't be destroyed. So is the IDF spokesman also a weak lefty traitor capo? The only thing that can sideline Hamas is a serious alternative, a horizon of hope, he says. Without that word, this never ends. This is Daniel Hagari. We've already pointed to this. Hamas cannot be destroyed. Here's another example. This is from Army and Security. The Army admits, even after all the operations and raids in Rafah, Hamas, quote, will remain in the city. So what are we doing then? If we're all these different angles are admitting that the one thing you say you need to do, even above getting the hostages, which we'll show you next, secondary, they told us, is to take out Hamas. And now you're saying it's not even possible. And yet right now you're still going. So what's happening here? All you're seeing is the real-time dismantling of the narrative they've spun, like everything else they're getting caught for. Muhammad Shihada, the IDF admits Hamas will remain after all the butchering, destruction, and starvation of Gaza and Rafah. Hamas was always the pretext, and Palestinians the target. They continue to slaughter to keep vengeful Israelis entertained by the scenes of blood and ruins. 94% of Israelis, he says, think the IDF is either using appropriate levels of force or in Gaza or isn't using enough. Now, I've seen the poll. I just don't ever trust polls. I agree. It's a clear majority. 94%, it doesn't feel right to me, but you guys can decide for yourselves. But it's clear the majority supports what's going on. Owen Jones says Israel has lost. Its own army spokesman has admitted they cannot defeat Hamas. He says this is a confession with devastating implications.
Israel's army has officially admitted it has lost the war. That's what the latest admission from the official Israeli military spokesperson amounts to. Now, remember the big official military objectives set by Israel from the very start. Firstly, secure the release of hostages by military means. Well, Israel has killed far more Israeli hostages by military means than it's rescued by military means, with the vast majority of those who were freed were so because of prisoner exchanges and a ceasefire. Now, the other official military aim was the military defeat of Hamas. Now, 8.5 months later, yes, they've slaughtered tens of thousands of people. Yes, many of them children. Yes, they've wiped most of Gaza from the face of the earth. Yes, they've severely maimed and injured countless numbers. Yes, they've imposed mass starvation on the Palestinian people alongside the deprivation of the essentials of life. Yes, they brutally incarcerated and tortured so many. Yes, they violently crushed the medical system. Yes, we could go on. But they've done all of that, but they haven't defeated Hamas. Not even close. And they're never going to militarily defeat Hamas. Now, if you don't believe me, listen instead to Brigadier General Daniel Hagari, spokesperson for the so-called Israel Defense Forces, as he told Channel 430 News, one of Israel's main news stations, the following. The idea of destroying Hamas is simply throwing sand in the eyes of the public. Hamas is an idea. Hamas is a political party. It is rooted in the hearts of people. Whoever thinks we can eliminate Hamas is mistaken.
Huge thing just happened right there, right? I mean, so there's a lot of things that happened around the same point, right? Where you saw the supposed pause that was happening in Rafah, which never actually happened, but just their own pause, like to stop so that aid can get through, which admitted that they were stopping aid. But it showed you a massive schism, a gap, a divide between the military and the political side. For whatever reason, I'm not going to pretend I could know what their intent is, but what's shocking is that they did this without the discussion of the War cabinet or Netanyahu and the leadership, who then came out and said, no way, that's crazy. We're not going to do that. And you say the same thing here, suddenly deviating from the central narrative that we have to get rid of Hamas. So there's very clearly something happening. Allegiances are dividing. People are realizing the writing is on the wall. I agree with this. This is a major moment. I'm hoping that it first and foremost amounts to stopping the killing in Gaza.
Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. It's been around for many, many years. Well, no shit, Einstein. Duh. This is something those of us who oppose this genocidal onslaught have been saying from the very start. Hamas emerged as a product of Palestinian suffering, of Palestinian misery, the product of languishing under a relentlessly brutal occupation of an Israeli state which violently prevents Palestinian national self-determination. Now, except that's not what Daniel Hagari was saying, but the point is, the absolute key point is, this is not some military force which you just pick off and that's the end of that one. It is rooted in Palestinian society. It is an idea which is where I think we would disagree, and it's not to support Hamas in any shape or form, is that it is a product of Palestinian suffering. And if you wish that to change, then you have to abolish Palestinian suffering. Now, as I've previously reported, US intelligence officials have privately been briefing that as well as the Israeli state killing fewer Hamas militants than claimed, Hamas's ranks are replenished by new militants because of one of the many consequences of engaging in mass slaughter is that many of the loved ones, the survivors of those butchered who've got nothing to lose, most of them didn't even have homes to go back to, become determined to fight those who have drowned their people in so much blood for the rest of their lives, in many cases.
Right. I mean, it's not hard to wrap your mind around. You've got people that are there who can't leave, who don't have a home, who are literally starving. People that would have never joined something like this are thinking, I mean, why wouldn't I at this point? Whatever your thoughts about Hamas, the idea that you're thinking, am I just going to stand here and be killed, or am I going to try to fight back? Kind of easy to see how this works. And my point is that is, I think at some level, not thought through with how this is all shifting, what they wanted to justify what they're doing. It's always how they played this game. They've just played they've played their hand all wrong from Israel's perspective. Like I said, they could have gone about this through the international community in the very beginning, never had to ask. I mean, they would have had support forever, like they already did. But they destroyed all this. They shot themselves in both feet. Everybody sees what they really are, and there's no putting this back anymore.
Now, Hagari also says that it will be impossible to return all the Israeli hostages being held in Gaza through military operations, saying we have to reach a scenario where the hostages are returned in another manner. Again, it's just offensive, isn't it? It's just deeply, deeply offensive. All of the things that we've said from day one being just repeated back by those who have prosecuted a genocidal war.
Yep, exactly. Make sure you watch the full clip. So, in regard to the hostages, now that this seems to be shifting, we'll see if this changes the ceasefire conversation. Doesn't seem to. Netanyahu's entire lifeline is keeping this thing going. But here's CBC back on 8 months ago saying defeating Hamas is priority. Everything else is secondary, says Israel. So now that you're seeing them admit that this wasn't even possible, you have to recognize they were just destroying Palestine. And even the hostages themselves were not. So if they knew they couldn't defeat Hamas, and they said that their hostages were secondary, you must realize they don't care about either. Guys, this is about Palestine at everything expense. Here, Jerusalem Post, destroying Hamas is more important than saving hostages. This is December 15th, 2023. And here is Francesca Albanese also from, and this post is from June 9th, simply saying UN rights expert Francesca Albanese says Israel could have freed all of the hostages alive and intact 8 months ago when in fact the first ceasefire and hostage exchange was put on the table, just like we reported then, and people said that was a lie, but it wasn't. It's easy to prove. Yet Israel refused to in order to continue to destroy Gaza and the Palestinians as a people. This is genocidal intent turned into action. And there's been, 12, 13 offers since then that they could have taken. They've refused. Their own people know this now, guys. Whether or not they want to go back to destroying Gaza afterward, they want to accept whatever they're offering to get their families back. This is so easy to verify at this point. And yet your government and their government don't care. Let that sink in. Now, this is the part that really kind of blew me away. Now, unfortunately, we might have to end early with this, which it's only been 3 hours, but I was going to keep going, but for other reasons, I might have to wrap here. The point was that at the very least, since we talked about this in the title, this admits a very important thing. What is called the Dahaya doctrine, known as mowing the lawn or mowing the grass, is important and is real, despite all of the screaming about how it's not true. I'll just start with these, actually. This is just funny. This kind of thing I was talking about. Israel has never used the term mowing the grass. It's not true. Here's what it actually means. This is on Wikipedia. The Dahaya doctrine is an Israeli military strategy involving the destruction of civilian infrastructure in order to pressure hostile regimes. There's no way that's a crime, no matter how you spin it. Human shield doesn't matter. To do that with the interest of pressuring other people to take action, that is a crime. You're not supposed to target civilian infrastructure, not even human shields dynamic, guys. That was called out right in the beginning. It says it is a type of asymmetric warfare. It endorses the employment of, quote, disproportionate force, also a crime. And this says compared to the amount of force used by the enemy to secure the end. The doctrine was outlined by former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot. The doctrine is named after the Dahaya neighborhood. This is in Beirut, where Hezbollah has headquarters during the 2006 Lebanon War, which, of course, was heavily damaged by the IDF. So not only do they use the term that is a crime in and of itself, they use the name from a crime they committed in Lebanon, bombing and destroying civilian areas in the interest of trying to hurt and drive action by the group they're fighting. It's just so plainly and easily identifiable. It's true. It's obvious. And yet people lie with agendas, your government included. But here's why this is being discussed. I mean, this is an article from today. Quote, intense phase of war with Hamas about to end. Focus to shift to Lebanon. They're expanding the war is what that means. Focus, not end of what's happening in Gaza, but the intense part of it. So we're just going to pull back a little bit in Gaza and start over here. Isn't that what you all wanted? I mean, that's crazy the way he's trying to make it sound like he's doing what people are asking by creating war with Lebanon, who, by the way, is also illegally occupied by Israel. Same tactics apply. Fourth Geneva Convention, occupied territory, armed resistance, same point. This is what he says on the record. Quote, it doesn't mean that the war is going to end. Well, he says Netanyahu, however, vowed that Israel would continue operating in Gaza until the militant group Hamas was eliminated. You know, the thing, his government is military, just admitted it wasn't possible. So all he's telling you is we're never going to stop. He says, quote, it doesn't mean that the war is going to end. He's been very clear about that. So who cares about your ceasefire agreements? That was never going to happen. But the war in its current stage is going to end in Rafah. So all he's really telling you is we're just going to stop aggressively bombing tents in Rafah for now. Well, he then goes, this is true. We will continue mowing the grass later. He actually said that. He spoke to Channel 14. Ask yourself why. I mean, I don't even understand these people anymore. I mean, how you can even rationalize this kind of murder, genocidal evil. But you know people are paying attention. You know we're watching. You know that people have discussed this term that's not supposed to even be real, even though it's easy to prove. It literally, on the record, means committing war crimes. And as we're all pointing at Rafah, he makes a statement about mowing the grass later. It goes on to say more than 1 million Palestinians were taking shelter in Rafah before Israel started its air and ground operation. But not a big one, though, Matt Miller. No, it's a small one, even though it's taken up the majority of the territory and displaced millions of people, but it's still a small operation. So as long as they can pretend that, they can pretend like we don't have to do anything, right? No. How embarrassing for them. How dumb that was. And they're still making these dumb arguments. It says, defying calls from the international community not to proceed, which one was a binding ICJ ruling, by the way. Around 800,000 people have since been displaced from Rafah. But it's a small operation, though, right? Small operation. Where conditions have been described by the UN as apocalyptic. The city's border crossing with Egypt, of course, a vital entry point for humanitarian aid, has remained closed since the Israeli military seized it last month. We're not blocking aid, though, and international pressure on Israel's actions in Gaza have mounted since it started its operation in Rafah. Last month, the UN's top court ordered them to immediately halt, but they did not, calling the situation disastrous. Netanyahu also weighed in on the ongoing negotiations to the end of the war, saying he was ready to make a partial deal. He's just insulting you guys. He's insulting everybody. A partial deal with Hamas to return some hostages while being held in captive in Gaza, but reiterating his position that the war will still continue to achieve the goal of eliminating Hamas. So anybody who's been pretending like this wasn't what he's been saying the whole time, you're either blind to what's happening or you're a liar. They've never been allowing or wanted or agreed to what they've been claiming the ceasefire agreement was about this whole time for months now. Negotiations and back and forth. And what Hamas do? And guess what? They're right. We demand that somebody is a guarantor, and that they actually start doing what they're going to do in the first phase. Why? Because they were never going to, and they knew that, and he's making it clear. It's amazing when you can recognize that Hamas, of all people, has been telling you the truth the whole time. It says, I'm not ready to give that up, Netanyahu says, meaning the pretend war on Hamas, which is aimed at Palestinians. He said Netanyahu's comments were at odds, of course, with the aim of a broader proposal outlined by U.S. President Joe Biden. At odds? You mean directly contradictory to the idea of a lasting ceasefire and withdrawal from Gaza, which is what the whole point was? The pretend that he agreed with? He says that plan, which the U.S. has said is an Israeli plan, how silly, sets out conditions intended to lead to the eventual release of all of the hostages in return for a permanent ceasefire, which was all that anybody's been asking for. And even Israel pretended. And then when Hamas accepted, they go, wait, no, lies, fake news, you're lying, just whatever they could say to, bomb Rafah, just whatever they could do to get you distracted from the fact that they're just using the process. Like we've said Saudi Arabia did with Yemen, like we've seen the United States do constantly pretty much everywhere they're involved with, and then act dishonestly, take human life and blame it on the other side. It says Israel's opposition politician, Gadi Eisenkot, said Netanyahu's remarks about a partial plan contradicted the wishes of the country's recently disbanded war cabinet, of which he was a member. So even their war cabinet were clear, and I think this is part of what's happening now. They disbanded the war cabinet, and now Netanyahu is making the choices here. And he's never been okay with this. They've been lying to you and prolonging the ongoing starvation and suffering the whole time under the guise they ever wanted a deal. It says, quote, a deal in one step, the so-called all for all, or a complete deal in 3 steps. The cabinet voted unanimously on this, meaning Netanyahu. That's why the prime minister's statement about a partial deal is against the war cabinet's decisions. This is what he told the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee on Monday. Quote, I think this requires clarification in light of the turmoil it causes to the families of the hostages. They don't care about the families. They don't care about the hostages. They don't care about anything but their aggressive Zionist agenda. And even their own people are starting to call it out. Here's what Washington Post wrote. With strikes targeting rockets and tunnels, the Israeli tactic of mowing the grass returns to Gaza. Oh, wait, that's 2021. Oh, I guess it didn't start on October 7th. What do you know? Mowing the grass. It's always been there, and we just pretend we don't know. For more than a decade, it says, when analysts describe the strategy utilized by Israel against Palestinian militants, they've used a metaphor. When with their displays of overwhelming military strength, Israel forces were, quote, mowing the grass. The phrase implies the Palestinian militants in Gaza and their supply of crude but effective homemade weapons are like weeds that need to be cut back. Such tactics have faced significant criticism, of course, from international human rights groups, often due to the disproportionate number of deaths caused by Israeli forces. Well, yeah, that's a crime, guys. You're bombing civilian locations, not because they happen to be, you're disproportionately affecting civilian life. It says, Zahava Golan, a former lawmaker with the Meretz party, wrote for Haaretz that the strategy results in perpetual war that forgets, quote, human beings are also able to walk, not only to carry a club. They're calling him out. This is belligerent war crimes. Quote, just like mowing your front lawn, this is the other side of it, the Israeli government backing this, that is constant, hard work. This is this Weinberg of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He wrote for Jerusalem Post, of course, saying, if you fail to do so, weeds grow wild and snakes begin to slither around in the bushes. Reminds me of a quote that we'll play here and probably just wrap here in a second that I think is relevant to this statement. This goes well before October 7th. And that is the idea that they see all Palestinians this way. This is from, I believe, 2018, if I remember correctly.
This is the defense minister, Moshe Yaalon,
2015.
talking just a couple of weeks ago. Israel is going to hurt Lebanese civilians, to include kids of the family. We went through a very long discussion. We did it then. We did it in the Gaza Strip. We are going to do it in any round of hostilities in the future. That's the defense minister. This is the military chief of staff, Benny Gantz. The next round of violence will be worse and see this suffering increase. He headed up the military assaults on Gaza, the last 2. This is the Minister for Education in the Netanyahu government. There will never be a peace plan with the Palestinians. I will do everything in my power to make sure they never get a state.
How do we not know this?
He also said, if you catch terrorists, you simply have to kill them. I've killed a lot of Arabs in my life, and there's no problem with that. This is the Minister for Justice. Palestinians are all enemy combatants. This also includes the mothers of the martyrs. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Right. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. That's the Israeli Minister for Justice in the last few months. The Israeli Deputy Minister for Defense. Palestinians are beasts. They are not human. The Minister for Foreign Affairs, CP Hotley, this is the last one. My position is that between the sea and the Jordan River, there needs to be one state only, the state of Israel.
Look at that.
There's no place for any agreement of any kind that discusses the concession of Israeli sovereignty over lands conquered in 1967. Now, these are the official statements of several ministers of the current government of Israel. In one case, actually advocating genocide of all Palestinians, including children, and calling them snakes.
It's worse today.
Now, can I ask you, Taoiseach, do you not think that if we're defining terrorism, that is the language and thinking of terrorists, that it is absolutely unacceptable in civilized politics, in civilized international relations, for the heads of government of a state that we carry on normal relations with and who you met in Paris to advocate those sort of views when we know they have also led on to the deaths of thousands of Palestinians, innocent men, women and children? What have you to say, Taoiseach, about those sort of views being expressed by the Israeli government?
Nothing. And Taoiseach's like the prime minister in Ireland. He's just calling him out and doesn't care. Now, here is what Elon Levy had to say, which is funny because this guy is just so desperate to be part of the conversation. And he says, Netanyahu on the 14 channel, the intensive stage of the war against Hamas is about to end. We will continue with mowing the grass. After the end of the intensive stage, we can move forward. So, it's funny that he would frame that. They're all of the same mind here, the Zionists we've been highlighting. They don't think, just like he said, they think they're beasts. They're not human. Most of the people he listed off are currently part of the government, guys. Here's Norman Finkelstein. I'll let me see, play that. And we'll end with this mowing the grass point before we play these last couple of videos. What I'll get into, and I'm gonna do my best to get into this tomorrow again, and in general to do more consecutive shows in general. I think that's important. But we're gonna get into the attacks that happened on Rafah, which actually I'll rattle these off at the end just so you guys can see what's happening. But we're gonna get into, in general, a lot more action being taken. This image I used for the show today is a real image of a man, and it's back. Yunus Sarawi is the one that took the information from their own social media accounts. And you can even check it with an AI software check, and it's not AI, despite this guy claiming that it's an AI image. The point is, this is a IDF soldier with either a fake baby fetus or a real one, cheersing with it with his gun. As they're killing children, women, and men in Gaza, including pregnant women, or leaving them in, it's horrifying. A lot of bad things happening. We'll discuss the Hindry job discussion about proving that it was clearly an Israeli tank and they continue to lie about it, Matt Miller included. The ongoing starvation tactics we'll get into possibly early tomorrow. This was going to be today, but just for time I have to wrap a little bit. But, we'll go over the starvation that is not going away. Obviously, children are starving, guys. Right now, as we speak, children are starving to death. And they're just acting like it's no big deal. Let's get some of these clips. We'll do this first, actually. Sarah Wilkinson highlighting that Al-Mawasi, again, 14 people were killed. And they just continue to bomb these refugee camps. Omar Bradar, they've done it again. Nearly every day for the past 260 days, Israel's committed another massacre against Palestinian civilians. Israeli strikes on tent camps near Rafah. 25 people killed. Over and over and over. This is how Alonzo highlights it goes. Israel does something unconscionable. Everyone is shocked. Step 3, Israel's outraged. How can you anti-Semites possibly think we do such an unconscionable thing? Step 4, Israel does the same unconscionable thing 78 times in a row. Over and over and over. Here's a story. 101 dead in 24 hours as Israel attacks Gaza neighborhoods. Omar asks, if 100 Israelis were killed in the last 24 hours, it would dominate your headlines. And our politicians would be competing to give speeches condemning the massacres. But it's Palestinians getting slaughtered, so hardly a mention from the media. No word from your representation. They also bombed the men that were trying to rebuild the water. It's been 48 hours since Israel murdered Gaza's water and environment chief engineer, along with 4 municipality officials, while they were working to restore the water. As I understand it, they had effectively restored this to some degree. Then they were bombed, destroying what they did and killing all of them. The games they keep playing about how it's not our fault and it's all them, it's all Hamas. Or they continue to make sure they don't have food and water. You can decide for yourself, and the facts are clear. And here's the release from the Gaza municipality highlighting the same thing. Just one war crime after another. Here's Norman Finkelstein highlighting what mowing the grass really is.
Now, there are two other facts that need to be brought into the picture. I have left out in my description so far that periodically Israel went into Gaza to quote unquote mow the lawn. And mow the lawn was the expression the Israelis coined for these periodic high-tech massacres in Gaza. The best known being Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, Operation Protective Edge in July-August 2014. And in each of these massacres, hundreds and sometimes thousands of Palestinians in Gaza were killed. Hundreds of children were killed. In Cast Lead, it was 350. In Protective Edge, it was 550 children. And then thousands and thousands and thousands of homes were pulverized, leveled, systematically, methodically, with no armed conflict in play. Just neighborhood after neighborhood was roped off. It's all described in Israeli soldier testimonies, roped off and demolished. They brought in the bulldozers and demolished thousands and thousands of homes. Bear in mind, 80% are refugees and children of refugees. And now their homes, and what they managed to build in those 50 or so years since 1948, the 48 war, and now their homes are demolished. And it's important, I feel, in my opinion, to keep in mind the language. What is mow the lawn? It's taking in an implement with blades on it to mow the lawn. But brace yourself, 50% of the blades in Gaza are children. You're taking blades to crack the skulls of children. That's the metaphor. And that, to me, at the risk of sounding emotive and hyperbolic, that to me is testament to the satanic nature of that state. To coin a phrase like mow the lawn in a population that's half children. And it's precisely that kind of language that enabled the horrors that we have seen unfold since October 7th.
He says that very well. And it's very hard to think about what he just described without becoming emotional. We're watching this play out. And here is an example of that. Israel calls this mowing the grass, or the Dagestan doctrine. It means to crush cities and cut the population or the grass. Western elites know of and accept this racist Israeli doctrine, which means carrying out genocide and crimes against humanity. Here's a father crying over his 2 dead children who were blades of grass to Israel. Now, we're going to end there, but I will include as well, we were going to get into, again, this was all, I was going to get into all this, but we're going to talk about Lebanon in the next show. I'm going to do my best to make it tomorrow. And just the incredible story that's happening here where, the whole point was, and I'll jump to the end here with this real quick, where they're telling you, we must target civilian infrastructure in Lebanon in June 12th. And then all of a sudden, guess what? New story, Hezbollah using Beirut airport to store Iranian weapon caches, which turned out to be a completely false story, which Telegram gets caught for, and everyone seems to be calling out. wherever it was here. I mean, the point is they've already had to delete part of the story. It's already been deleted and altered, right? I mean, it's the ridiculous story is they're doing this. Well, here's examples of them using. This is a hospital that they're using as one of their bases, showing you who's actually doing all the things they're accusing everybody of. Or the fact that, as you can see here, this is Ben Gurion Airport. You know, a civilian airport where they're bringing through all sorts of weaponry. Interesting how it's only one-sided. Or the fact that here's an American arms shipment landing in Ben Gurion Airport this morning. This was today. The plane did not appear on tracking software, right? So who's actually using them for military purposes? I find it's very interesting. And meanwhile, using white phosphorus over Lebanon, which is what they've done over and over and over throughout the years. This is, can you see that on the screen? Yeah, there you go. So anyway, we'll come to this more. The point, though, is that this has already had to have been retracted for the most part. Oh, wait, I forgot something just now. Oh, that's right. We were going to get into I'll come back to it tomorrow. There's another point we're going to get into about human shields you might have seen. We'll talk about it more tomorrow. It's been circulating. This guy who was tied to the front of a Jeep. He's telling you what happened to him. They beat him up. They tortured him, essentially. Tied him to a top of a Jeep, which was so hot that it burned his skin, and human shield on display. Over and over and over. Matt Miller doesn't care. We'll come back to it all. But the point about this is an interesting biohazard overlap. This point is that Lebanon is clearly just another extension of this, which is always part of it. It's all so very obvious. I'm hoping people are starting to see what we have continued to show. But thank you for tuning in tonight, guys. Continue to stand up and speak out about this, about any number of these angles or, whatever, there's so much that we can highlight, whether it's about Israel or whether it's about the United States or whether it's about their foreign policy, COVID-19 medical freedom. We're under attack in a lot of ways. And I think that at the same time, because I shouldn't say we're under attack in so many ways, because I deeply believe that we are seeing change happen, which there's always these moments of opportunity. The two-party illusion always getting in the way. But I believe there's something shifting right now. And I just think it's a good moment to try to take advantage of what's happening and change things in a positive way. So do something about that. Never calling for violence. Stand up and speak your mind. Protest if you need to. Start petitions, make shows, but do something. Don't stand by passively and allow this to happen around you. Take advantage of this. Change people's minds. Have conversations about what we're talking about. I've never seen something so clear. You can open people's minds to this if you just present them with the right information. And just like the COVID situation, there's going to be some that'll just determined to not see it. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the honest people that don't really look into the certain things, that just, that believe they're supposed to fight for Israel because of their religion, as much as that's contradictory when you actually understand what's going on. But if you show them those moms and dads out there, the children that are being murdered, those are the kind of people that just don't know what's happening. As shocking as that may sound. Find the courage to stand up for these people. They need your support. They're dying as we talk about this right now. And in general, your government, to the larger point, is continuing to surreptitiously invade and destabilize foreign countries for their benefit at their expense and your expense, as they turn around and call you a domestic terrorist for saying something about it. It's time to stand up before they sit you down. So thank you for supporting us and continuing to support this platform. As always, there's lots of ways to do so. We need your support. So there's plenty of links down below the video. There's endless ways to do so, but really the most important thing is to share the content, talk about the content, find the courage. I love you all. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Come on. Zodina.
Seeing some civilians nearby. Do it.